Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out today's sponsor, Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. Don't waste hours trying to find the best buy list price for your cards online. Simply send them to Card Conduit and let them take care of the rest. I have used Card Conduit multiple times already. I always use them to get the best value for my extra cards. I get fair prices for my cards and they save me tons of time. They have three main services. Their standard service lets you send them your unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. They give you the best price for your cards. They work with competitive buy listing partners, including ones not open to the public. Users get an average of 19% more for their collection than they would from any major retail buy list, even with Card Conduit's fees. Card Conduit also optimizes buy listing for card condition as well. Since vendors have different penalties for wear and tear, Card Conduit will find the best buy list priced against the specific condition of the card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the description below or use the promo code POWER, you will also get 10% off of their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's video. Welcome to the definitive CEDH compilation of Niv-Mizzet Parun. Niv's ability to draw cards and deal damage is unparalleled. This makes for some lethal combinations with cards like Curiosity and Tandem Lookout. Niv's uncounterability ensures it always hits the battlefield and asserts total control. The stack is sure to get out of hand with spells and triggers, and when it comes to control, Niv is king of the castle. Shauna won the Pass the Ball challenge and gets to start us off. Shauna draws a card for turn and plays a Scalding Tarn. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. She casts a turn 1 Mystic Remora. Shauna passes. Zach draws a card for turn and plays a Fiery Islet. He taps it to cast a Soul Ring. Remora triggers and Shauna draws. Zach passes. Claby draws and plays an Arid Mesa. They crack it, pay a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. They cast a Soul Ring and Shauna draws from Remora. They cast a Mox Diamond and Shauna draws again. It enters and Claby discards a Godless Shrine. They cast a Llanowar Elves and end their turn. Ryan draws and plays a Mountain. He casts an Enslaved Dwarf. Ryan chips the turn to Shauna. During her upkeep, Shauna lets her Remora die. She draws and plays a Steam Vents into play untapped, paying 2 life. She casts a Sensei's Divining Top. She pays 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probe, targeting Zach. She looks at Zach's hand and draws a card. She passes, discarding to hand size. Zach draws and casts Sensei's Divining Top. He activates top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. He activates top, drawing a card and putting top on top. He plays a Polluted Delta for turn. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. Zach ships the turn to Claby. Claby draws and plays a Homeward Path. They cast their commander, Timna the Weaver. They move to combat and attack Shauna with Llanowar Elves. In response, Shauna casts Rapid Hybridization, targeting Timna. Timna is destroyed and Claby creates a 3/3 Frizzard. Then Shauna takes it and Claby passes the turn. Ryan draws and plays an Urza's Saga, getting its first counter. He casts his commander, Magda, Brazen Outlaw. He moves to combat and attacks Shauna with Enslaved Dwarf. Magda triggers and Ryan creates a treasure. Then Shauna takes it and Ryan gives the turn over to Shauna. During her upkeep, Shauna spins her top, rearranging the top 3. She draws and plays an island. She casts Pentad Prism, entering with 2 counters. Shauna passes. Zach draws and cracks his Polluted Delta, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. Zach ends his turn. Claby draws and recasts their commander, Timna the Weaver. They move to combat and attack Zach with Llanowar Elves and Shauna with their Frizzard. They both take it, and in their second main phase, they lose 2 life and draw 2 cards through Timna. They play a Snow-Covered Forest for turn. They cast Carpet of Flowers. Claby passes to Ryan. Ryan draws, and in his first main phase, Urza's Saga gets another counter. He plays a Great Furnace for turn. He moves to combat and attacks Shauna with Magda and Enslaved Dwarf. Magda triggers, and Ryan creates 2 treasures. Shauna takes it, and Ryan passes the turn. Shauna draws and casts Trinket Mage. It enters, and Shauna fetches up a Jeweled Lotus into her hand. She casts Jeweled Lotus. She passes. Zach draws and plays a City of Brass. He taps it and his Fiery Islet to help cast its commander, Elsha of the Infinite. Zach looks at the top card of his library. With nothing else, Zach ends his turn. Claby draws and moves to combat. They attack Ryan with Timna and Llanowar Elves and attack Shauna with their Frizzard. In response, Ryan activates Urza's Saga, creating a construct. Unfortunately, Claby didn't see that coming as Ryan moves to blocks. Ryan blocks Timna with the construct and Shauna blocks the Frizzard with Trinket Mage. Then Ryan takes the rest and Claby gains 2 life. In their second main phase, Claby adds 3 green through their carpet. They play in an exotic orchard as their land for turn. They cast their other commander, Kodama of the East Tree. They cast Feyburrow Elder. In response, Shauna casts Snap, targeting Kodama. Kodama bounces, and Shauna untaps 2 lands. Then Feyburrow Elder resolves. Turn thwarted, Claby passes to Ryan. Ryan draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. In response, Shauna casts Slip Out the Back, targeting Magda. Magda gets a +1/+1 counter and then phases out. Then Ryan floats mana and sacrifices Urza Saga, fetching up an Ashnod's Transmigrant onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Guide Lantern. It enters and exiles Zach's Polluted Delta from his graveyard. He casts a Dwarven Armorer. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Lightning Bolt. He moves to combat and attacks Shauna with his Construct. Shauna takes 7, and Ryan passes the turn. At the end of Ryan's turn, Shauna spends the top. Shauna draws and activates top, drawing a card and putting top on top. She casts a Mox Opal. She plays a Cephalid Coliseum for turn. She cracks her Jeweled Lotus to help cast her commander, Niv-Mizzet Parun. It enters, and then Shauna ends her turn. Zach draws and starts off his turn by casting Jeska's Will, choosing both modes, targeting Claby. Elsha's Prowess and Niv-Mizzet trigger. Shauna draws, Niv triggers again, targeting Ryan's Enslaved Dwarf. In response, Ryan casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Niv-Mizzet. Niv triggers, Shauna draws, then Niv triggers again, dealing a damage to Dwarven Armor. In response to Red Blast, Shauna casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Red Blast. Niv triggers, and in response, Zach casts a Fierce Guardianship of his own for its alternate cost, targeting Shauna's Fierce. Elsha and Niv trigger. Shauna draws, Niv triggers again, dealing 1 damage to Dwarven Armor, killing it. Then Elsha gets +1/+1. In response, Shauna activates Cephalid Coliseum, cracking it, drawing 3, and discarding 3. Niv triggers 3 times, dealing 3 to Elsha. With Fierce still on the stack, Shauna casts Misdirection for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card, targeting Zach's Fierce. Niv-Mizzet triggers, and in response, Zach taps his City of Brass to help cast Pyroblast, targeting Misdirection. Elsha's Prowess and Niv triggers. Shauna draws, Niv triggers again, and then Shauna deals 1 damage to Elsha, killing her. With nothing else, Elsha's trigger fizzles, Pyroblast counters Misdirection, Shauna draws from Niv-Mizzet, Niv triggers, she deals a damage to Claby's Llanowar Elves, Elves dies, then Fierce counters Fierce, Shauna draws from Niv, Niv triggers again and deals a damage to Feyburrow Elder, then Red Blast destroys Niv-Mizzet, Niv pings Enslaved Dwarf, Dwarf dies, and Elsha's other prowess ability fizzles. Finally, with no other answers and the board all but wiped out, Jeska's Will finally resolves. Zach adds 4 red and then exiles Transmute Artifact, Felwar Stone, and Final Fortune. This seems like very unassuming flips, but they are actually fantastic in Elsha. Zach plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He casts Sensei's Divining Top. He casts Felwar Stone from exile. He casts Transmute Artifact from exile. In response, Ryan sacrifices his Soul Guide Lantern, drawing a card, hoping to find an answer. He does not find it, and in response, Shauna casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card, targeting Transmute. In response, Zach casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, exiling Force of Will. With no other answers, Transmute Artifact resolves, Zach sacrifices Felwar Stone, and then fetches up a Helm of Awakening onto the battlefield. Zach casts Final Fortune from exile, getting an extra turn. Zach passes to his next turn. Zach draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He taps his City of Brass and his Fiery Islet to help recast his commander, Elsha. Zach then presents a loop of activating top, drawing a card and putting top on top, then casting it for free through Elsha and Helm of Awakening. He then draws 40 cards. He casts Mana Crypt. He plays a Plateau for turn. He casts Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Zach creates 9 treasures. He casts Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards Mental Misstep. He casts Underworld Breach. He casts Brain Freeze, milling Claby's library. He cracks his Lion's Eye Diamond, discards his hand, adding 3 blue. He escapes Brain Freeze 2 more times, milling out Ryan and Shauna. He then escapes Wheel of Fortune. Each opponent discards their hands and attempts to draw from an empty library, lose, and Zach wins the game. Ashani had the most moving interpretive dance and gets to start us off. Ashani draws a card for turn and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts a Birds of Paradise. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays an island. He pays 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probe, targeting Sean. He looks at Sean's hand and draws a card. He casts a Soul Ring. Zach passes. Ryan draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Seize the Day. He casts a Reckless Impulse, exiling a Crystal Vein and a Rite of Flame. He ends his turn. Sean draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Soul Ring. He follows it up with a Talisman of Dominance. He ships the turn to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays a Plateau. He cracks his Jeweled Lotus to help cast his commander, Rocco, Cabaretti Caterer, where X equals 2. Rocco enters and Ashani fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the battlefield. Dockside enters and Ashani creates 6 treasures. He casts an Imperial Recruiter. It enters and Ashani fetches up a Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker into his hand. He casts Quarian Ranger. He passes. Zack draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He floats a blue, then casts Frantic Search. He draws 2, discards 2, and untaps his 2 lands. He casts a Brainstorm. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. He casts a Goblin Engineer. It enters and he fetches up a Jeweled Lotus into his graveyard. Zack gives the turn to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a Crystal Vein from exile as his land for turn. He casts Rite of Flame from exile, adding 2 red. Ryan casts his commander, Rionia, Fire Dancer. He ends his turn. Sean draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator. Sean passes. Ashani draws and casts a Grasp of Fate. It enters and exiles Goblin Engineer, Rionia, and Malcolm. Ryan moves Rionia to the command zone. Ashani moves to combat and attacks Sean with all of his creatures. Sean takes the hit, and Ashani ships the turn to Zack. Zack draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He ends his turn. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. He floats mana and sacrifices it, fetching up a Soul Ring onto the battlefield. He casts a Chaos Warp, targeting Grasp of Fate. It resolves, Ashani shuffles in Grasp of Fate, and then reveals a Mana Crypt, putting it onto the battlefield. Grasp of Fate triggers, and Malcolm, Rionia, and Goblin Engineer return to the battlefield. Goblin Engineer enters, and Zack fetches up a Spellskite into his graveyard. Ryan ends his turn. Sean draws and casts a Gamble. He fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Chain of Vapor. He plays a Command Tower as his land for turn. He casts a Glenhorn Buccaneer. In response, Zack casts Mana Drain, countering Glenhorn. Sean moves to combat and takes his revenge out on Zack by attacking him with Malcolm. Zack takes the hit, Malcolm triggers, and Sean creates a treasure. With nothing else, Sean passes. At the end of Sean's turn, Ashani activates his Quarian Ranger, returning Taiga to his hand and untapping his Birds of Paradise. He casts Beast Within, targeting Goblin Engineer. In response, Zack cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Steam Vents onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. Zack hard casts Deflecting Swat, changing the target of Beast Within to Imperial Recruiter. Beast Within resolves, Imperial Recruiter is destroyed, and Ashani creates a 3/3 Beast. The turn moves to Ashani. During Ashani's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Taiga. He casts a Teamer Sabertooth. The table knows that this is game over, so in response, Ryan casts a Braid, dealing 3 damage to Dockside Extortionist, killing it. Teamer Sabertooth then resolves, and Ashani casts Lightning Bolt, killing Goblin Engineer. Ashani moves to combat and attacks Zack with Rocco, Quarian Ranger, and his Beast. Zack takes the hit, and Ashani gives the turn to Zack. Zack draws, and in his first main phase, he has 3 colorless through Mana Drain. He casts a Felwar Stone. He ends his turn. During Ryan's upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Sean with Rionia. Sean takes it, and Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Sean taps his Talisman of Dominance to help cast a Vampiric Tutor. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. The turn moves to Sean. Sean draws and casts Reanimate, targeting the Glenhorn Buccaneer in his graveyard. In response, Zack hard casts Force of Negation. In response, Sean hard casts Force of Will, targeting Force of Negation. Force of Will resolves, Force of Negation is countered, and with Reanimate still in the stack, Ryan casts a Deflecting Swat, targeting Reanimate. Deflecting Swat resolves, changing the target of Reanimate to Zack's Goblin Engineer in his graveyard. Reanimate resolves, Goblin Engineer enters, and Sean loses 2 life. Engineer triggers, and Sean fetches up a Lion's Eye Diamond into his graveyard. He moves to combat and attacks Zack with Malcolm. Zack takes the hit, Malcolm triggers, and Sean creates a treasure. Sean ends his turn. During Ashani's upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt trigger. He draws and casts a Toski, Bearer of Secrets. He moves to combat and attacks Sean with his Beast and Teamer Sabertooth, and attacks Zack with Quarian Ranger and Rocco. Both players take the hit, Toski triggers, and Ashani draws 4 cards. In his second main phase, Ashani plays a Gemstone Caverns. He casts an Archon of Emeria. He ships the turn to Zack. Zack draws and plays an Ottawara Soaring City into play tap through Archon of Emeria. He gives the turn to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Cursed Mirror, entering as a copy of Toski. He moves to combat and attacks Zack with Rionia and a Cursed Toski. Zack takes the hit, Toski triggers, and Ryan draws 2 cards. Ryan passes. Sean draws and moves to combat. He decides to continue to pick on Zack, attacking him with Malcolm. Zack takes it, Malcolm triggers, and Sean creates a treasure. In his second main phase, Sean taps his Talisman of Dominance to help cast a Dothy Voidwalker. He ends his turn. During Ashani's upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Quarian Ranger and Zack with the rest of his creatures. Both players take the hit, and Zack dies. His Goblin Engineer that is under Sean's control ceases to exist. Toski triggers, and Ashani draws 6 cards. In his second main phase, Ashani plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Stomping Ground onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Tendershoot Dryad and gains the city's blessing. He ships the turn to Ryan. During Ryan's upkeep, Ashani creates a 1/1 Saproling, and Ryan wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts a Cathartic Pyre, dealing 3 damage to Archon of Emeria, and it gets exiled through Voidwalker. Ryan casts a Humble Defector. He casts a Wheel of Fortune. In response, Ashani casts a Braid, dealing 3 damage to Voidwalker, killing it. Wheel of Fortune then resolves, and each player discards their hand and draws 7. Ryan plays a Mountain for turn. He sacrifices his Crystal Vein to add 2 colorless. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts a Valakut Awakening, putting all 4 cards from his hand onto the bottom of his library and drawing 5. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Mox Opal. He casts a Desperate Ritual, adding 3 red. He casts a Heat Shimmer, targeting Humble Defector. In response, Sean channels Ottawara Soaring City, targeting Defector. Defector bounces back to Ryan's hand and Heat Shimmer fizzles. Ryan cracks his Lotus Petal to help recast Humble Defector. He moves to combat and Rionia triggers. He targets Humble Defector, creating 6 copies. Ryan activates all of his Defector copies and draws a total of 12 cards. He gives 3 Defectors to Sean and 3 to Ashani. Ryan moves to his second main phase and casts a Mox Diamond, discarding a Mountain. He casts a Final Fortune. In response, Sean casts a Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts Ad Nauseam. With no other answers, Ad Naus resolves. Sean reveals a Mana Confluence, Imperial Seal, Deflecting Swat, Notion Thief, Mindbreak Trap, and a Red Elemental Blast, deciding that stopping at 3 life is probably a good idea. Sean casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, exiling Final Fortune. Disappointed that he isn't passing to himself, Ryan passes the turn. At the end of Ryan's turn, all of the Humble Defector copies are exiled, and Ryan discards the hand size. During Sean's upkeep, Ashani makes a Saproling. Sean draws and casts a Praetor's Grasp, targeting Ryan. He fetches up a card from Ryan's library into exile face down. He casts said card, which turns out to be an Underworld Breach. In response, Ashani casts Crop Rotation, sacrificing his Gemstone Caverns, fetching up a Gaia's Cradle onto the battlefield. Ashani then casts a Silence. It resolves, locking out opponents from casting spells this turn. Disappointed, Sean moves to combat. He attacks Ashani with Malcolm. Ashani takes it, Malcolm triggers, and Sean creates a treasure. Sean shifts the turn to Ashani. At the end of Sean's turn, Ashani activates Temur Sabertooth and returns Rocco to his hand. Sean discards the hand size, and the turn moves to Ashani. During Ashani's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Temple Garden into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts a Grand Abolisher. With no answers, Abolisher resolves, locking out opponents. He casts an Eternal Witness. It enters, and he returns Dockside Extortionist from his graveyard to his hand. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, creating 11 treasures. Ashani presents a loop of bouncing Dockside to his hand with Temur Sabertooth and recasting it again and again to create infinite treasures. He returns Eternal Witness to his hand and casts it. It enters, and he returns Kiki Jiki Mirror Breaker from his graveyard to his hand. He returns Eternal Witness to his hand and recasts it. It enters, and he returns Imperial Recruiter from his graveyard to his hand. He casts Imperial Recruiter. It enters, and he fetches up a Village Bellringer into his hand. He casts Kiki Jiki. He casts Village Bellringer. It enters, and in response, Ashani taps Kiki Jiki to create a copy of Village Bellringer. He presents a loop of untapping Kiki with the Bellringer's ETB, creating a copy of Bellringer and repeating it until he has infinite Bellringers with haste. He attacks each of his opponents for lethal, and Ashani wins the game. Zach won the 48-hour challenge and gets to start us off. Zach draws a card for turn and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast an Izzet Signet. He gives the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Mountain. He casts a Soul Ring. He casts a Felwar Stone. Ryan ends his turn. Sean draws and plays a Badlands. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Wheel of Fortune. Everyone discards their hands and draws 7. Sean ships the turn. Ashani draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts an Esper Sentinel. He passes. Zach draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast a Pentad Prism for a Sunburst of 2, entering with 2 counters. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Mox Opal. He ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Mountain. He casts his commander, Rionia Fire Dancer. He gives the turn to Sean. During Sean's upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Dockside Extortionist. In response, Zach casts Mana Drain. Esper Sentinel triggers and Zach pays. In response, Sean casts Swan Song, targeting Mana Drain. Esper triggers and Sean pays. In response, Zach casts a Misdirection for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card targeting Swan Song. Misdirection resolves and changes the target of Swan Song to Misdirection itself. Swan Song fizzles, Mana Drain resolves, countering Dockside. Sean ends his turn. Ashani draws and plays an Ottawara Soaring City as his land for turn. He casts a Mystic Remora. He moves to combat and attacks Sean with Esper. Sean takes it, and Ashani passes. During Zach's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, and in his first main phase, he adds 2 colorless through Mana Drain. He plays an island for turn. He taps his Mana Confluence and removes a counter from Pentad Prism to help cast his commander, Niv-Mizzet Parun. He ships the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Mountain. He casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Niv-Mizzet. Niv-Mizzet, Esper, and Remora all trigger. Ashani draws 2, Zac draws 1, Niv triggers again and kills Esper Sentinel. Then Red Elemental Blast resolves and Niv-Mizzet is destroyed. Next, Ryan casts Harnfell, Horn of Bounty. Remora triggers and Ashani draws. Ryan activates Harnfell, discarding a mountain and exiling Seething Song and Cathartic Pyre. He activates Harnfell, discarding Crimson Wisps and exiles a mountain and an Expedite. He activates Harnfell, discarding Fury of the Horde and exiling a Lotus Petal and a mountain. He plays a Lotus Petal from exile. Remora triggers and Ashani draws. Ryan moves to combat and attacks Sean with Rionia. Sean takes the hit and Ryan ends his turn. During his upkeep, Sean loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Blood Crypt, into play untapped, paying 2 life. He ships the turn to Ashani. During Ashani's upkeep, he pays to keep his Mystic Remora. He draws and plays an island. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Rushing River. He casts a Blind Obedience. He gives the turn to Zac. During Zac's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an island. He casts a Trinket Mage. It enters tapped through Blind Obedience, and then he fetches up a Lion's Eye Diamond into his hand. He casts the Lion's Eye Diamond. Remora triggers, and in response, Sean flashes in a Notion Thief. It enters tapped through Blind Obedience. Ashani declines to draw with Notion Thief in play. Lion's Eye Diamond resolved, and it comes into play tapped through Blind Obedience. Next, Zac casts Jeweled Lotus. Remora triggers, Ashani declines to draw, and Jeweled Lotus enters tapped. Zac taps his Mana Confluence and his Ancient Tomb and sacrifices his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 red. He recasts his commander, Niv-Mizzet Parun, into play tapped. Zac passes the turn. Ryan draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ashani with Rionia. Ashani takes it, and Ryan ends his turn. During Sean's upkeep, he wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts a Mnemonic Betrayal. Niv-Mizzet triggers, and Sean steals the draw through Notion Thief. Mnemonic Betrayal resolves and exiles all of his opponent's graveyards. Sean casts Zac's Lion's Eye Diamond from exile, and it enters tapped. Sean casts Ryan's Wild Magic Surge, targeting Blind Obedience. Remora triggers, and Ashani declines to draw. Niv triggers, and Sean steals the draw. Surge resolves, and Blind Obedience is destroyed. Ashani reveals cards from the top of his library until he reveals Grasp of Fate, putting it onto the battlefield. Grasp enters and exiles Zac's Jeweled Lotus, Ryan's Harnfell, and Sean's Notion Thief. Sean casts Ashani's Mana Crypt from exile. Remora triggers and Ashani draws. Sean casts Arcane Signet and Ashani draws off of Remora. Sean casts Ryan's Red Elemental Blast from exile, targeting Remora. Remora and Niv-Mizzet trigger, Ashani draws, Zac draws, and Niv-Mizzet pings Sean for 1. Sean passes to Ashani, and the cards exiled with Mnemonic Betrayal are returned to their graveyards. Ashani draws and plays an Arcane Signet. He casts a Sensei's Divining Top. Ashani gives the turn to Zac. During his upkeep, Zac wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts a Spellskite. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Goblin Matron. It enters, and he fetches up a Dockside Extortionist into his hand. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, creating 11 treasures. Zac moves to combat, attacking Ashani with Trinket Mage and Niv-Mizzet. Ashani takes the hit, and Zac ships the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a mountain. He casts a Mana Ball. He casts a Tormenting Voice, discarding a card and drawing 2. Niv-Mizzet triggers, Zac draws, and pings Sean for 1. Ryan casts a Gamble. Niv triggers, Zac draws, and pings Sean. Gamble resolves, and Ryan fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Combat Celebrant, which is what he tutored for. He moves to combat and attacks Sean with Rionia. Sean takes the hit, and Ryan passes. During Sean's upkeep, 2 Mana Crypts trigger. In response, he casts Vampiric Tutor. Niv triggers, Zac draws, and pings Sean for 1. Vampiric Tutor resolves, and Sean fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. The Mana Crypt triggers resolve, and Sean loses both, taking 6 damage. He draws and casts Harnfell, Horn of Bounty. In response, Ashani activates his Divining Top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. With no answers, Harnfell resolves. Sean activates Harnfell, discarding a Deflecting Swat and exiling Gamble and Verdant Catacombs. He plays a Verdant Catacombs from exile. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. Sean ends his turn. At the end of Sean's turn, Ashani activates Top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. Ashani draws and plays a Plains. He casts Savine's Reclamation, targeting Out of Time in his graveyard. Niv triggers, Zac draws, and pings Sean for 1. In response, Zac casts Muddle the Mixture, targeting Savine's Reclamation. Niv triggers, Zac draws, and pings Sean again. In response, Sean casts an Offer You Can't Refuse, targeting Muddle the Mixture. Niv triggers, Zac draws, and pings Sean. In response, Zac casts Pyroblast, targeting Offer. Niv triggers, Zac draws, and pings Sean again. Pyroblast counters Offer, and Muddle counters Savine's. With nothing else, Ashani ships the turn to Zac. During Zac's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt trigger and takes 3 damage. He draws, Niv triggers, and pings Sean. He plays a Training Center for turn. He casts a Frantic Search. Niv triggers, Zac draws, and pings Sean again. Frantic Search resolves, Zac draws 2, discards 2, and untaps 3 lands. Niv triggers and pings Sean for 2. He casts a Gamble. Niv triggers, Zac draws, and pings Sean. In a last-ditch effort to stay alive, Sean activates Harnfell, Horn of Bounty, discarding Witchclaw Talisman, and exiling Polluted Delta and Lotus Petal. He activates Harnfell, discarding Thassa's Oracle, and exiles a Glenhorn Buccaneer and a Mental Misstep. Gamble then resolves, Zack fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards an Ophidian Eye, which is what he tutored for. He casts a Mystic Remora. He casts a Talisman of Creativity. He moves to combat and attacks Sean with Niv-Mizzet and Ashani with Trinket Mage, Goblin Matron, and Dockside. They both take it all, and Sean dies. Zack then ships the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and debates some interaction, but decides not to with Spellskite on the battlefield. He plays a mountain and then passes the turn. At the end of Ryan's turn, Ashani activates his top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. Ashani draws and plays an island. He casts an Unwinding Clock. Remora triggers, Zack draws and pings Ashani for 1. Ashani casts his commander, Shorikai, Genesis Engine. Remora triggers, Zack draws and pings Ashani again. In response, Zack casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Shorikai. Niv triggers, Zack draws and pings Ashani. In response, Ashani activates his top, drawing a card and putting top on top. Ashani then casts a Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card targeting Fierce Guardianship. Niv and Remora trigger, Zack draws 2 and pings Ashani twice. In response, Zack casts a Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Force of Will. Niv triggers, Zack draws and pings Ashani. Flusterstorm counters Force of Will and Fierce Guardianship counters Shorikai. After all that mess, Ashani ends his turn. Ashani untaps his artifacts with Zack through Unwinding Clock. During his upkeep, Zack pays for his Remora. He wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws, Niv triggers, and pings Ashani. He plays an island as his land for turn. He casts a Ledger Shredder. He moves to combat and attacks Ashani with all of his creatures. Ashani takes the hit, and in his second main phase, Zack casts a Felwar Stone. Ledger Shredder triggers, Zack connives, giving Shredder a counter. Niv triggers, pinging Ashani. Zack gives the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and decides he's gonna sit back and watch the fireworks, passing the turn to Ashani. Ashani draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts a Hullbreaker Horror. He casts a Sensei's Divining Top. Hullbreaker, Remora, and Ledger Shredder trigger, with Ashani targeting Niv-Mizzet with the Hullbreaker trigger. Zack draws off of Remora and pings Ashani. Then Zack connives through Ledger Shredder, discarding Goblin Engineer, giving Shredder a counter. Niv triggers and pings Ashani. In response to the Hullbreaker trigger, Zack casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost. Niv triggers, Zack draws and pings Ashani. Swat resolves and changes the target of Horror's ability to Horror itself, returning it to Ashani's hand. After quite a while in limbo, Sensei's Divining Top finally resolves. Ashani ends his turn. Ashani untaps his artifacts with Zack through Unwinding Clock. During Zack's upkeep, he pays to keep his Remora and wins his Mana Crypt trigger. Still in Zack's upkeep, Ashani activates top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. He activates top, drawing a card and putting top on top. Holding priority, Ashani casts Silence. Niv and Remora trigger, Zack draws twice, and Niv pings Ashani for 2. In response, Zack casts Mystical Tutor. Niv triggers, Zack draws and pings Ashani for 1. Mystical Tutor resolves and Zack fetches up a Dig Through Time onto the top of his library. Still in response to Silence, Zack casts Rapid Hybridization targeting Rionia. Niv triggers, Zack draws and pings Ashani. Ledger Shredder triggers and Zack connives, discarding a land. Niv triggers and pings away Ashani's last life, killing him. Rapid Hybridization resolves, destroys Rionia, and Ryan creates a 3/3 Frog Lizard. Zack finally gets the draw for his turn. Niv triggers and pings Ryan. Zack plays a Command Tower as his land for turn, and then delves away some of his graveyard to cast Dig Through Time. Zack looks at the top 7 cards, puts 2 into his hand and the rest on bottom. He casts a Brainstorm. Niv triggers, Zack draws and pings Ryan. Then Zack draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. Niv triggers and pings Ryan for 3. Zack casts a Preordain. Niv triggers, Zack draws and pings Ryan for 1. Then Zack scries 2 and draws. Zack casts Cyclonic Rift targeting Ryan's Frizzard. Niv triggers, Zack draws and pings Ryan, and then the Frizzard token floats out of existence. Zack moves to combat and attacks Ryan with everything. Ryan takes it all, and Zack ships the turn. Ryan draws and casts Rionia, Fire Dancer. In response, Zack casts Delay. Niv triggers, Zack draws and pings Ryan. Delay resolves, countering Rionia, and Ryan sends her to the command zone. Ryan passes. During Zack's upkeep, he loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, Niv triggers, and pings Ryan. Zack hard casts Mogg Salvage targeting Mana Vault. Niv triggers, Zack draws, and pings Ryan again. In response, Ryan casts a Chaos Warp targeting Niv-Mizzet. Niv triggers, Zack draws, and pings Ryan. In response, Zack casts an Offer You Can't Refuse. Niv triggers, Zack draws, and guess what? Pings Ryan again. Chaos Warp is countered, and Ryan creates 2 treasures. Mogg Salvage resolves and destroys Mana Vault. Next, Zack casts a Mox Diamond, discarding an Arid Mesa. He transmutes Tolaria West, fetching up a Pact of Negation into his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with all of his creatures. Ryan takes the hit and goes to 2 life. In his second main phase, Zack casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting his own Niv-Mizzet. Niv triggers, Zack draws, and pings Ryan to 1 life. Holding priority, Zack casts Pact of Negation, targeting his Red Elemental Blast. Niv-Mizzet triggers, Zack draws, and Niv-Mizzet Parun deals the final damage to Ryan, killing him, and Zack wins the game. John draws a card for turn and plays an Emergence Zone. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He passes. Ryan draws and plays a Mountain. He also passes. Cruz draws and casts Jeweled Lotus. He cracks his Lotus to help cast his commander, Sisay, Weatherlight Captain. He casts a Lion's Eye Diamond. He plays a Bayou for turn. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Finished up, Cruz ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and casts Mox Diamond, discarding an island. He plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. Zach ends his turn. John draws, takes no actions, and passes. Ryan draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts a Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Ryan creates 4 treasures. He sacrifices 3 treasures to cast his commander, Anya Falconwrath. Finished up, Ryan ships the turn to Cruz. Cruz draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts an Arcane Signet, then passes to Zach. Zach draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a Polluted Delta for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts a Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside, and Zach creates 3 treasures. All through, Zach ends his turn. John draws, mutters under his breath, takes no actions, and passes. Ryan draws, plays a Cabal Pit, and ends his turn. Cruz draws and plays a Tropical Island. He casts his own Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Cruz creates 6 treasures. He casts a Grim Hireling. He moves to combat and attacks John with Sisay. Before damage, Zach casts Rapid Hybridization targeting Grim Hireling. It resolves, Hireling is destroyed, and Cruz creates a 3/3 Frog Lizard. Then John takes the hit, and Cruz ends his turn. At the end of Cruz's turn, Zach casts Mystical Tutor, fetching up a Force of Will onto the top of his library. During Zach's upkeep, Ryan activates Anya, discarding Psychotic Episode. Anya triggers, and in response, Ryan casts Psychotic Episode for its madness cost, targeting Zach. Episode resolves, Zach reveals a hand, and the top of his library, which is his Force of Will. Then Ryan puts Zach's Force of Will onto the bottom of his library. Then Anya untaps, and Ryan draws. Zach draws for turn, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. Zach floats a colorless, then sacrifices Urza Saga, fetching up a Jeweled Lotus onto the battlefield. He plays Otawara, Soaring City as his land for turn. He cracks his Lotus to help cast his commander, Niv-Mizzet Parun. All through, Zach ends his turn. John draws, mutters a bit louder this time, takes no actions, and passes. Ryan draws, also takes no actions, and ends his turn. At the end of Ryan's turn, Cruz cracks his Lion's Eye Diamond, discards his hand, and adds 3 white. He uses his floating mana and sacrifices treasures to activate Sisay, fetching up Ragavan Nimble Pilferer onto the battlefield. The turn moves to Cruz. Cruz draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks John with Ragavan. John takes it, Ragavan triggers, John exiles Field of the Dead from the top of his library, and Cruz creates a treasure. All through, Cruz passes to Zach. Zach draws and Niv-Mizzet triggers, targeting and killing Ragavan. He plays a Training Center for turn. He casts a Trinket Mage. It enters, and Zach fetches up a Grafdigger's Cage into his hand. He casts Grafdigger's Cage. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Niv-Mizzet. Before damage, Ryan activates Anya, discarding Murderous Compulsion. Anya triggers, and in response, Ryan taps his Cabal Pit to help cast Murderous Compulsion for its madness cost, targeting Niv. Niv-Mizzet triggers, Zach draws, and deals 1 damage to Anya. In response, Zach casts an Offer You Can't Refuse. Niv-Mizzet triggers, Zach draws, and deals another damage to Anya. Offer resolves, Murderous Compulsion is countered, and Ryan creates 2 treasures. Then Anya untaps, and Ryan draws. Still before damage, Ryan activates Anya again, this time discarding Dark Withering. Anya triggers, and in response, Ryan casts Dark Withering for its madness cost, targeting Niv again. Zach, wondering how in the world Ryan always has it, responds by casting Mog Salvage for its alternate cost, targeting Cruz's Arcane Signet. Niv-Mizzet triggers, Zach draws, and deals 1 more damage to Anya, killing it. Then Mog Salvage resolves, and Signet is destroyed. Then Dark Withering resolves, killing Niv-Mizzet. Then Anya's ability resolves, and Ryan draws. After some bloody interaction, Zach ends his turn. At the end of Zach's turn, Ryan casts Shadow of the Grave, returning Murderous Compulsion and Dark Withering to his hand. John draws and exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He casts Crucible of Worlds. After finally getting to play Magic this game, John ends his turn. Ryan draws and casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He recasts his commander, Anya Falconwrath. He activates Anya, discarding Curse of Fool's Wisdom. Anya triggers, untaps, and Ryan draws. He activates Anya again, discarding Violent Eruption, Murderous Compulsion, and Dark Withering, untapping Anya and drawing each time. Ryan plays a Blood Crypt into play untapped, paying 2 life. Unable to find what he needed through his rummaging, Ryan ships the turn to Cruz. Cruz draws and casts Kinnan, Bonder Prodigy. He casts Smuggler's Share. Cruz moves to combat and attacks Zach with his Frog Lizard and a 4/4 Sisay. Zach takes it all, and Cruz passes the turn. Zach draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He takes no other actions and ends his turn. John draws, sighs, takes no actions, and passes. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Wishclaw Talisman. He activates Wishclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to John. He casts Cabal Ritual with Threshold, adding 5 black. He casts Cloudstone Curio. He casts Blazing Root Walla. It enters, Curio triggers, and Ryan returns Dockside Extortionist to his hand. He recasts Dockside, creating 7 treasures. Curio triggers, and Ryan returns Blazing Root Walla to hand. Ryan presents a loop of casting Root Walla, returning Dockside to his hand, and then casting Dockside, returning Root Walla to his hand to create infinite mana. He then casts Blazing Root Walla, now returning Anya to his hand. He casts Anya, returning Root Walla to his hand, then activates Anya, discarding and drawing a card. Ryan presents another loop of casting Blazing Root Walla, returning Anya to his hand, then casting Anya, returning Root Walla to his hand, then activating Anya, rummaging through his deck until he finds Fiery Temper. He casts Fiery Temper, then rummages through his deck again until he finds Kozilek, Butcher of Truth. He discards it through Anya, shuffling his graveyard back into his library. He repeats this process over and over until his opponents are dead, and Ryan wins the game. But Cruz has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Simian Spirit Guide. Ryan draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He passes. Cruz draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts Magda, Brazen Outlaw. He ends his turn. Zach draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He ships the turn to John. John draws and plays a Misty Rainforest of his own. He casts a Mana Crypt. He passes. At the end of John's turn, Ryan cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. Ryan draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns, which for some reason feels a lot less valuable than Cruz's. Ryan ends his turn. Cruz draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks John with Magda. Magda triggers and Cruz creates a treasure. John takes it, and in his second main phase, Cruz casts his commander, Sisay, Weatherlight Captain. He passes. Zach draws, plays an island, and ends his turn. At the end of Zach's turn, John cracks his Misty Rainforest, paying a life. In response, Zach cracks his own Misty Rainforest, paying a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. Then John fetches up an Overgrown Tomb onto the battlefield tapped. The turn moves to John. During his upkeep, John loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He passes. Ryan draws, does nothing, and moves to his end step. He discards Kitchen Imp to hand size, and the Imp's Madness ability triggers. Ryan casts Kitchen Imp for its Madness cost. He ends his turn. Cruz draws and again moves straight to combat. He attacks John with Magda and Zach with Sisay. Magda triggers and Cruz creates a treasure. They both take it, and Cruz ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays an island. He casts a Trinket Mage. In response, John cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Blood Crypt onto the battlefield tapped. Then Trinket Mage enters, and Zach fetches up a Jeweled Lotus into his hand. He casts Jeweled Lotus. In response, Cruz casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, countering Lotus. Zach grumbles, then passes the turn. During his upkeep, John wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Stomping Ground into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts his commander, Lord Windgrace. He activates Windgrace's first ability, discarding Field of the Dead and drawing 2 cards. John ends his turn. Ryan draws, takes no actions, and moves to his end step. He discards Strength of Lunacy to hand size, and Strength of Lunacy's Madness ability triggers. Ryan casts Strength of Lunacy for its Madness cost, targeting Kitchen Imp. Having officially dubbed his only creature a Raving Lunatic, Ryan passes. Cruz draws and moves to combat. He attacks Lord Windgrace with both Magda and Sisay. Magda triggers and Cruz creates a treasure. Windgrace takes 5 and Cruz ends his turn. Zach draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He ships the turn to John. During his upkeep, John loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. John draws and casts a Soul Ring. He plays a Command Tower for turn. He casts Imperial Seal. In response, Cruz pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting Imperial Seal. In response, John casts Worldly Tutor. It resolves and he fetches up a Gitrog monster onto the top of his library. Then Misstep counters Imperial Seal. Next, John activates Windgrace's first ability, discarding Arid Mesa and drawing 2 cards. He casts the Gitrog monster. In response, Zach casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, exiling the frog. Plans thwarted, a very sad John ends his turn. Ryan draws and casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Ryan creates 4 treasures. He casts his commander, Anya Falconwrath. He activates Anya, discarding Archfiend of Spite. Anya triggers, untaps, and Ryan draws. He activates Anya again, discarding Curse of Fool's Wisdom, From Under the Floorboards, Bloodhall Priest, Alms of the Vein, Weirded Vampire, Asylum Visitor, and a Muckdrub, untapping Anya and drawing each time. Finally, having found what he was looking for, Ryan plays a Polluted Delta and then passes the turn. Cruz draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Lord Windgrace with Magda and Sisay. Magda triggers and Cruz creates a treasure. John declares no blocks and Windgrace dies. Cruz passes. At the end of Cruz's turn, Zach cracks his Arid Mesa, pays a life, and fetches up a Steam Vents onto the battlefield tapped. Zach draws and plays a mountain. With no further actions, he ships the turn. During his upkeep, John wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts a Dragon's Rage Channeler. He casts Imperial Recruiter. Recruiter enters and John fetches up a Witherbloom Apprentice into his hand. John passes. At the end of John's turn, Ryan cracks his Polluted Delta, pays a life, and fetches up a Blood Crypt onto the battlefield tapped. He then activates Anya, discarding City of Brass and drawing a card. The turn moves to Ryan. Ryan draws and plays a Swamp. He casts Witchclaw Talisman. He passes. Cruz draws and casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters and, in response to the trigger, Ryan sacrifices a treasure and adds a red. Then Cruz creates 4 treasures. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Magda. Magda triggers, and Cruz creates another treasure. Zach blocks Magda with Trinket Mage, and both creatures die. In his second main phase, Cruz sacrifices 7 treasures to cast Rocco, Cabaretti Caterer, where X equals 4. In response, Zach casts Mana Drain, countering Rocco. Cruz sighs and ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws, and in his first main phase, he had 7 colorless through Mana Drain. Unfortunately, he can't find a good use for it, takes no actions, and ends his turn. During his upkeep, John wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts Witherbloom Apprentice. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Imperial Recruiter as an additional cost. Witherbloom and Dragon's Rage Channeler both trigger. John surveils one and leaves it on top. He then gains 1 life and each of his opponents lose 1 life through Witherbloom. Then Calling the Weak resolves and John adds 4 black. He casts Abundant Growth, targeting Stomping Grounds. Channeler triggers, John surveils, leaving it on top again. Abundant Growth enters and John draws a card. He casts Peer into the Abyss. Witherbloom and Darcy both trigger. John surveils, leaves it on top, then his opponents each lose 1 life and he gains a life. In response to the Peer, Zach casts Narset's Reversal, targeting Peer into the Abyss. In response, Ryan casts Tybalt's Trickery, targeting Peer into the Abyss. Trickery counters Peer, John mills 2, and then exiles until he reveals a Utopia Sprawl, casting it, naming red as it enters. Then Narset's Reversal fizzles, much to Zach's dismay. After lamenting that he paid 7 mana for a Utopia Sprawl, John moves to combat. He attacks Cruz with a Delirious Darcy. Cruz takes 3, and John ends his turn. At the end of John's turn, Ryan activates Anya, discarding Verdant Catacombs and drawing a card. Ryan draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a snow-covered mountain onto the battlefield. He activates Wishclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Wishclaw to Cruz. Ryan casts Imperial Seal. In response, Zach hard casts Mental Misstep, countering Seal. Ryan activates Anya, discarding World Gorger Dragon and drawing a card. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Dance of the Dead, targeting World Gorger in his graveyard. Dance resolves and World Gorger enters. World Gorger triggers, and in response, Zach casts Rapid Hybridization, targeting World Gorger. All eyes stare at Ryan, who grins, but doesn't have a response. Hybridization resolves, destroying World Gorger. World Gorger's second ability triggers, and Ryan floats mana. Then the second ability resolves, but there is nothing to return. Then the first ability resolves, exiling all of Ryan's permanents. Living by the dragon and dying by the dragon, Ryan sighs and uses his floating mana to cast Cloudstone Curio. Now a clean slate, Ryan ends his turn. Cruz draws and moves to combat. He attacks John with Sisay and Zach with Dockside. They both take it, and in his second main phase, Cruz activates Wishclaw, fetching up a card into his hand, and then generously giving Wishclaw back to the now destitute Ryan. Cruz plays a Verdant Catacombs for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. Cruz passes. Zach draws and plays an Ottawara Soaring City as his land for turn. He casts his commander, Niv-Mizzet Parun. He ships the turn to John. During his upkeep, John loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and recasts his commander, Lord Windgrace. Dragon's Rage Channeler triggers, John surveils 1, putting it into the graveyard. He activates Windgrace's first ability, discarding and drawing. He plays a Dryad Arbor as his land for turn. He casts Dark Confidant. He moves to combat and attacks Cruz with Darcy and Witherbloom. Cruz takes it, and John ends his turn. Ryan draws, takes no actions, and passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Cruz casts Brain Freeze, targeting himself. Niv-Mizzet triggers, Zach draws, and Niv-Mizzet deals 1 damage to Dark Confidant, killing it. Then Brain Freeze resolves, and Cruz mills 3. The turn moves to Cruz. Cruz draws and casts Mox Diamond, discarding Flooded Strand. He casts an Ad Nauseam. Niv-Mizzet triggers, Zach draws, and Niv-Mizzet deals 1 damage to Cruz. Then Ad Naus resolves. Cruz reveals a Tundra, Phyrexian Metamorph, Displacer Kitten, Pact of Negation, Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, Scrubland, Smothering Tithe, Carpet of Flowers, Professional Facebreaker, Eladomri's Call, Badlands, Plateau, Lotus Petal, Windswept Teeth, Mana Confluence, Tainted Pact, and a Demonic Consultation, deciding to stop there. He casts Lotus Petal. He casts Carpet of Flowers. He moves to his second main phase and adds 4 blue through his carpet. He casts Phyrexian Metamorph. It enters as a copy of Dockside, and Cruz creates 6 treasures. He casts Displacer Kitten. He casts Demonic Consultation. Displacer Kitten and Niv-Mizzet trigger. Zach draws, deals 1 damage to Cruz, then Displacer Kitten's trigger resolves, targeting Dockside. Dockside flickers, and Cruz creates 6 more treasures. Consultation resolves, and Cruz names Thassa's Oracle. He exiles the top 6 cards, and then exiles until he finds Oracle, which is the 3rd card from the bottom. He casts Thassa's Oracle. Oracle enters, and Cruz wins the game. Zach had the longest handstand and gets to start us off. But Corey has a pre-game action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Carplusian Forest. Zach draws a card for turn and plays a Training Center. He passes. Cal draws and plays a Sulphurous Springs. He taps it to help cast Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. He ships the turn. Brandon draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a forest onto the battlefield. He casts a Boreal Druid and ends his turn. Corey draws and plays a Copperline Gorge. He casts an Allosaurus Shepherd. He casts Elvish Mystic. He passes. At the end of Corey's turn, Zach casts Mystical Tutor, fetching up a Rapid Hybridization onto the top of his library. Zach draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He gives the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays his own Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He moves to combat and attacks Corey with Ragavan. Much to Cal's surprise, Corey blocks with Allosaurus Shepherd. Both creatures die, and in his second main phase, Cal casts a Felwar Stone. He ends the turn. Brandon draws and plays a forest. He casts his commander, Marwyn the Nurturer. He passes the turn. Corey draws and plays a command tower. He casts Magus of the Moon. In response, Zach floats a blue. Magus resolves and both Urza Sagas die. Before changing phases, Zach casts Rapid Hybridization targeting Magus. Magus dies and Corey creates a 3/3 Frog Lizard. With nothing else, Corey passes to Zach. Zach draws and plays an island. He casts Copy Artifact, entering as a copy of Felwar Stone. He ships the turn. At the end of Zach's turn, Cal casts Lightning Bolt, killing Marwyn. Cal draws and casts Strike It Rich. He creates a treasure and passes. Brandon draws and plays a forest. He casts Sylvan Library. He casts a Green Sun Zenith where X equals 1. He fetches up Aquarian Ranger onto the battlefield, shuffling Green Suns back into his library. He ends his turn. Corey draws and moves to combat. He attacks Cal with his Frizzard. Cal takes it, and in his second main phase, Corey casts Imperial Recruiter. Recruiter enters, and he fetches up a Treasonous Ogre into his hand. He gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and casts Soul Ring. He casts a Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, and Zach creates 3 treasures. He passes the turn to Cal. Cal draws and casts Wheel of Misfortune. In response, Zach casts Submerge for its alternate cost, targeting Boreal Druid. Wheel of Misfortune resolves, Brandon takes 7, then everyone but Corey discards their hand and draws 7. Cal casts Sensei's Divining Top and ends his turn. During his draw step, Brandon draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 8 life to keep them both. In his main phase, he casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Chrome Ox, imprinting Reclamation Sage. He casts his commander, Marwyn. He casts Finehorn Elves. Marwyn triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. He ships the turn. Corey draws and casts a Soul Ring. He casts Dockside Extortionist. In response, Cal activates his top, drawing a card and putting top on top. Dockside enters, and Corey creates 9 treasures. He casts his commander, Atali, Primal Conqueror. Atali enters, Zach exiles Mystic Remora, Cal exiles Sensei's Divining Top, Brandon exiles Soul's Majesty, and Corey exiles Crop Rotation. Corey casts Mystic Remora from exile. He casts Sensei's Divining Top from exile. He casts Crop Rotation from exile, sacrificing Gemstone Caverns as an additional cost. He fetches up a Gaia's Cradle onto the battlefield. He casts Soul's Majesty from exile, targeting Atali. In response, Zach casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, targeting Soul's Majesty. Mystic Remora triggers, and in response, Corey activates top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. Remora's trigger resolves, and Corey draws. Still in response, Corey casts Autumn's Veil. Veil resolves, Force of Negation fizzles, and Soul's Majesty resolves. Corey draws 7 cards. He casts Arcane Signet. He activates top, looking at and rearranging the top 3. He casts Bala Ged Recovery, returning Autumn's Veil to his hand. He moves to his end step, and in response, Brandon casts Force of Vigor for its alternate cost, exiling a green card, targeting Zach's Soul Ring and Mystic Remora. Remora triggers and Corey draws. Force of Vigor resolves, and both are destroyed. Corey passes, discarding to hand size. Zach draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts his commander, Niv-Mizzet Parun. He ships the turn. Cal draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast his commander, Ob Nixilis, Captive Kingpin. He taps Sulphurous Springs to help cast Imperial Seal. Niv-Mizzet triggers and Zach draws. Niv triggers again, and Zach deals 1 to Quirion Ranger. Imperial Seal resolves, and Cal fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He passes to Brandon. During his upkeep, Brandon wins his Mana Crypt roll. During his draw step, he draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 4 life to keep 1 extra. In his main phase, he plays a forest. He casts Collector Roof. In response, Corey casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Niv-Mizzet. Niv triggers, Zach draws, Niv triggers again, and deals 1 to Finehorn Elves. In response, Zach casts Thunderclap for its alternate cost, sacrificing a mountain, targeting Marwyn. Niv triggers, Zach draws, and Niv deals a damage to Corey's Dockside. In response, Brandon taps Marwyn for 2 green. Thunderclap resolves, killing Marwyn. Still in response to Red Elemental Blast, Zach casts Daze for its alternate cost, bouncing an island, targeting Blast. Niv triggers, Zach draws, and deals a damage to Corey's Dockside, killing it. Daze resolves, and Corey pays 1. Still in response to Red Elemental Blast, Zach casts Pyroblast, targeting Atali. He draws through Niv and deals a damage to Corey's Elvis Mystic. Red Elemental Blast finally resolves, killing Niv-Mizzet. Next, Brandon recasts his commander, Marwyn. He ends his turn. Corey draws and casts Treasonous Ogre. He pays 3 life through Ogre, adding a red. He casts Eternal Witness. Witness enters, and Corey returns Dockside Extortionist to his hand. He moves to combat and attacks Brandon with a Tally in his Frizzard. Brandon takes it, and Corey ships the turn. Zach draws and plays a Cephalid Coliseum. He passes, discarding to hand size. Cal draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Firebrand Archer. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Witchclaw Talisman. Firebrand Archer triggers and deals a damage to Cal's opponents. Ob Nixilis triggers, Cal exiles a snow-covered mountain and puts a +1/+1 counter onto Ob Nixilis. He moves to combat and attacks Corey with Ob Nixilis. Corey takes the hit, and Cal gives the turn to Brandon. During his upkeep, Brandon wins his Mana Crypt roll. During his draw step, he draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 4 life to keep 1 extra. In his main phase, he plays a Wirewood Lodge. He casts Elvish Mystic. Marwyn triggers and gets a counter. He casts Worldly Tutor. In response, Zach activates Cephalid Coliseum, drawing 3 and discarding 3. Worldly Tutor resolves, and Brandon fetches up an Eternal Witness onto the top of his library. He casts Elvish Visionary. Visionary enters, Marwyn gets a counter, and Brandon draws a card. He taps Marwyn, adding 3 green. He activates Wirewood Lodge, untapping Marwyn. He casts Eternal Witness. Witness enters, targeting Natural Order in Brandon's graveyard. In response, Corey evokes Endurance, exiling a green card. Endurance enters, Brandon puts his graveyard onto the bottom of his library, Endurance is sacrificed, then Eternal Witness fizzles. Next, Brandon casts Wirewood Symbiote. He activates Symbiote, bouncing Elvish Visionary, untapping Marwyn. He recasts Elvish Visionary, drawing a card and putting a 1/1 counter on Marwyn. He casts Llanowar Elves, putting a counter on Marwyn. He passes the turn. Corey draws and pays 3 life through Ogre, adding a red. He activates Castle Garenbrig, adding 6 green. He pays 6 life to activate Atali, transforming it into Atali, Primal Sickness. He moves to combat and attacks Cal with Atali and Brandon with Treasonous Ogre, Imperial Recruiter, and the Frizzard. In response, Brandon activates Wirewood Symbiote, bouncing Elvish Visionary to untap Marwyn. He blocks over with Marwyn, Recruiter with Collector Oof, and the Lizard with Eternal Witness. Cal declares no blocks, and then dies to Infect. In his second main phase, Corey plays Beseiju, who endures. He ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a command tower. He passes. At the end of Zach's turn, Corey casts Force of Vigor, exiling a green card, targeting Sylvan Library and Zach's Felwar Stone. In response, Brandon activates Wirewood Symbiote, bouncing Elvish Mystic, targeting Marwyn. In response, Zach casts Snap, bouncing Marwyn and untapping 2 lands. Force resolves, destroying Sylvan Library and Felwar Stone. The turn moves to Brandon. During its upkeep, Brandon wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and recasts Marwyn. He casts Elvish Visionary. He draws a card and puts a counter on Marwyn. He plays a Forest for turn. He casts Elvish Mystic, putting a counter on Marwyn again. He ends his turn. Corey draws and moves to combat. He attacks Brandon with Atali and Zach with Eternal Witness and the Lizard. Corey blocks with Marwyn, Elvish Visionary, Collector Oof, and Llanowar Elves. Then they both take the hit and Brandon gains 4 poison counters. In his second main phase, Corey casts Soulless Jailer. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Extortionist enters and Corey creates 2 treasures. He gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays an island. He casts Gilded Drake. In response, Corey casts Autumn's Veil. In response, Zach casts an Offer You Can't Refuse. Veil is countered and Corey creates 2 treasures. Gilded Drake resolves and exchanges control of Atali. Zach passes. During his upkeep, everything hinges on Brandon's Mana Crypt roll. He rolls, loses, takes 3, and dies. The turn moves to Corey. Corey draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zach with the Lizard, Eternal Witness, Gilded Drake, and Dockside. Zach blocks Witness with his Dockside and takes the rest. Corey ends his turn. Zach draws and casts Curiosity, targeting Atali. He moves to combat and attacks Corey with Atali. Corey blocks with Soulless Jailer and takes 7 and gets 7 poison counters. Curiosity triggers and Zach draws. In his second main phase, Zach plays an island. He casts a Trinket Mage. He fetches up a Jeweled Lotus into his hand. He casts Jeweled Lotus. He passes. Corey draws and casts Vexing Shusher. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with everything. Zach blocks Dockside with Trinket Mage and takes the rest. Corey gives the turn back to Zach. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Corey with Atali, killing him, and Zach wins the game. Cal draws for turn and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He casts Dark Ritual, adding 3 black. He casts his commander, Obnixilis, Captive Kingpin. He casts a Mana Vault. He casts Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. With an explosive turn 1 complete, Cal passes to Brandon. Brandon draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a forest onto the battlefield. Obnixilis triggers, Cal exiles an Ad Nauseam, and puts a +1/+1 counter onto Obnixilis. Brandon casts a Soul Ring. He ships his turn. Corey draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Soul Ring. He gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Training Center. He passes the turn. Cal draws and plays a Swamp. He casts Ad Nauseam from exile. In response, Zach casts an Offer You Can't Refuse. Ad Naus is countered and Cal creates 2 treasures. Next, Cal casts Grape Shot, targeting each opponent. They each take 1, and Obnixilis triggers 3 times. Cal exiles Opposition Agent, Curse Mirror, and Goblin Engineer, putting a counter onto Obnixilis each time. He moves to combat and attacks Corey with his Obnixilis. Corey takes the hit, and Cal ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays Beseiju, who endures as his land for turn. He casts Utopia Sprawl, enchanting his forest, choosing green as it enters. He casts his commander, Marwyn the Nurturer. He casts Worldly Tutor. He fetches up a Quirion Ranger onto the top of his library. He ships the turn. Corey draws and plays a Copperline Gorge. He casts Sylvan Library. He passes. Zach draws and casts Preordain. He scries 2 and draws a card. He plays an island for turn. He gives the turn to Cal. During his draw step, Cal takes a damage through his Mana Vault. He plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He moves to combat and attacks Brandon with Obnixilis. Brandon takes it, and Cal ships the turn. Brandon draws and casts Quirion Ranger. Marwyn triggers and gets a +1/+1 counter. He casts Sylvan Library. He ends his turn. During his draw step, Corey draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 8 life to keep them both. He plays a Mountain for turn. He casts Survival of the Fittest. He gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He passes to Cal. At the end of Zach's turn, Cal casts Tainted Pact. He exiles cards from the top of his library until he reveals Cataract Parasite, putting it into his hand. The turn moves to Cal. During his draw step, Cal takes a damage through his Mana Vault. In his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He casts Cataract Parasite. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Obnixilis. Zach takes it, and in his second main phase, Cal casts Firebrand Archer. Before Cal moves phases, Zach responds by cracking his Arid Mesa, paying a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. Ob Nixilis triggers, Cal exiles a Wooded Foothills and puts a +1/+1 counter onto Ob Nixilis. Then Cal moves to his end step, the cards stay in exile permanently through Ob Nixilis, and the turn moves to Brandon. During Brandon's draw step, Sylvan Library and Cataract Parasite trigger. Brandon takes a damage, Ob Nixilis triggers, Cal exiles Feed the Swarm, and Ob gets a counter. Then Brandon draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 8 life to keep them both. Cataract Parasite triggers twice, dealing 2 to Brandon. Ob Nixilis triggers twice, getting 2 counters, and Cal exiles Faithless Looting and a Reckless Fireweaver. In his main phase, Brandon casts Scale Up, targeting Marwyn. In response, Zach hardcasts Fierce Guardianship, targeting Scale Up. In response, Brandon convokes Chord of Calling where X equals 1. In response, Zach casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, targeting Chord. Force counters and exiles Chord, and Fierce counters Scale Up. Next, Brandon casts Llanowar Elves. Marwyn triggers and gets a 1/1 counter. With his plans foiled, Brandon passes. At the end of Brandon's turn, Corey activates Survival of the Fittest, discarding Dualcaster Mage and fetching up a Dockside Extortionist into his hand. During his draw step, Sylvan Library and Cataract Parasite trigger. He takes the damage, then draws 2 additional cards through Sylvan Library, paying 4 life to keep 1 extra. Cataract Parasite triggers twice, dealing 2 damage to Corey. Ob Nixilis triggers twice, getting 2 +1/+1 counters, and Cal exiles Burnt Offering and Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. In his main phase, Corey plays a mountain. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, creating 5 treasures. He activates Survival of the Fittest, discarding Godo Bandit Warlord, and fetches up a Temur Sabertooth into his hand. He casts Temur Sabertooth. He activates his Sabertooth, bouncing his Dockside. He recasts Dockside, creating 5 treasures. He demonstrates a loop of bouncing and recasting Dockside, netting treasures each time. He uses this loop to create infinite treasures. He then casts and bounces his commander, Atali Primal Conqueror, infinite times, exiling everyone's library. Corey passes. One by one, each player attempts to draw from an empty library, loses, and Corey wins the game. Ryan had the best Gandalf impersonation and gets to start us off. But both Cal and Drake have pre-game actions. Cal puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Burn Offering. Drake also puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Mana Vault. Ryan draws and plays a Plateau. He casts Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. He passes. Zach draws and plays a Tolaria West. He ships the turn to Cal. Cal draws and plays a snow-covered mountain. He casts Talisman of Indulgence. He taps his Talisman to cast Dragon's Rage Channeler. He ends his turn. Drake draws and casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Ancient Tomb. He casts Lavinia, Azorius Renegade. The table sighs, and Drake passes to Ryan. Ryan draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Zach with Ragavan. Zach takes it, Ragavan triggers, Ryan creates a treasure, and Zach exiles Thunderclap from the top of his library. In his second main phase, Ryan plays a Scrubland. He casts Dark Confidant. He ends his turn. Zach draws and casts Brainstorm, drawing 3 and putting 2 back on top. He plays a Wooded Foothills for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts Ponder. He looks at the top 3, doesn't like what he sees, shuffles, and draws. Zach bemoans the fact that in addition to his draws being mediocre, a bug just flew into his drink. Everyone laughs, and Zach passes the turn. Cal draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts his commander, Ob Nixilis, Captive Kingpin. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Dragon's Rage Channeler. Zach takes it, Ob Nixilis triggers, Cal puts a 1/1 counter onto Ob Nixilis, and exiles Cursed Mirror from the top of his library. With no further actions, the turn moves to Drake. Drake draws and casts Drannith Magistrate. The table groans, with Cal's being noticeably louder, and Drake passes. During his upkeep, Ryan reveals a Mana Vault into his hand through Dark Confidant. Ob Nixilis triggers, Cal puts a counter onto Ob Nixilis, and then exiles Final Fortune from the top of his library. Ryan draws and then moves to combat. He attacks Zach with Ragavan. Zach takes it, Ragavan triggers, Ryan creates a treasure, and Zach exiles Misdirection. In his second main phase, Ryan plays a Luxury Suite. He casts a Mana Vault. All through, Ryan ends his turn. Zach draws and casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dark Confidant. Zach passes. Cal draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Darcy and Drake with Ob Nixilis. They both take it, Ob Nixilis triggers, Cal puts a counter onto Ob Nixilis, and then exiles Deflecting Swat from the top of his library. In his second main phase, he casts Firebrand Archer. After a spirited debate on the mediocre power of Hour of Devastation, the turn moves to Drake. Drake draws and casts the new sheriff in town, Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. With no further actions, Drake ends his turn. During Ryan's upkeep, he reveals Ad Nauseam through Dark Confidant, losing 5 life. He draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Ragavan. Zach takes it, Ragavan triggers, Ryan creates a treasure, and Zach exiles Pyroblast. In his second main phase, Ryan casts a Pyroblast from his hand, destroying Lavinia. He then casts Ad Nauseam. Lotho triggers, Drake loses a life and creates a treasure. Ob Nixilis triggers, Cal puts a counter onto Ob Nixilis and exiles Luxury Suite. With Ad Nauseam still on the stack, Zach casts Force of Will for its alternate cost, paying a life and exiling a blue card. Ob Nixilis triggers again, gets another counter, and Cal exiles Lotus Petal from the top of his library. Force counters Ad Naus, and a sad Ryan passes the turn. During Zach's upkeep, he reveals Soul Ring through his Phantasmal Confidant, losing a life. Ob Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Cal exiles Jeweled Lotus. Zach draws and casts a Soul Ring. He casts Goblin Engineer. Lotho triggers and Drake loses a life and creates a treasure. Ob Nixilis triggers, gets another counter, and Cal exiles City of Brass. Engineer enters and Zach fetches up a Jeweled Lotus into his graveyard. Zach passes. At the end of Zach's turn, Cal cracks his Verdant Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up a Blood Crypt onto the battlefield tapped. He then casts Vampiric Tutor. Firebrand Archer and Dragon's Rage Channeler trigger. Cal surveils, leaving it on top. Then Archer deals 1 damage to each of his opponents. Ob Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Cal exiles Underworld Breach. Then Vampiric Tutor resolves and Cal fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Still in Zach's end step, the table decides to waylay Cal's plans, and Ryan cracks his Scalding Tarn, paying a life. Cal realizes with horror that Ob Nixilis' trigger is not a May ability. Ob Nixilis triggers, gets another counter, and Cal dejectedly exiles All Will Be One off of the top of his library, while glaring at Drannith Magistrate. Then Ryan fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. After a busy and heartbreaking end step, the turn moves to Cal. Cal draws and plays a Luxury Suite from exile, and before you ask, yes, you can play lands from exile through Drannith Magistrate. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with a very swole 13-12 Ob Nixilis. Ryan takes 13, Cal bemoans the large stack of cards in exile that are now lost forever, and the turn moves to Drake. Drake draws and casts his commander, Timna the Weaver. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Drannith and Zach with Lotho. They both take it, Ob Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Cal exiles a mountain. In his second main phase, Drake pays 2 and draws 2 through Timna. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. Lotho triggers and Drake loses a life and creates a treasure. Ob Nixilis triggers, gets another counter, and Cal exiles Cabal Ritual. Drake casts Siren Storm Tamer and ends his turn. During Ryan's upkeep, he reveals Blood Crypt through Dark Confidant. During his draw step, he takes a damage through his Mana Vault. Ob Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Cal exiles a Braid. Ryan plays a Blood Crypt into play untapped, paying 2 life. Holding mana open, he passes the turn. During Zach's upkeep, he reveals Ancient Tomb through Phantasmal Confidant. He draws and casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Ancient Tomb. Just like Ryan, he takes no further actions and ends his turn. During Cal's upkeep, Ryan, wary of being killed off by the buff Ob Nixilis, cast a Kicked Orange chant targeting Cal. Chant resolves, locking out Cal from spells or attacking this turn. He draws and plays a mountain from exile. Hands tied, he passes. Drake draws and moves straight to combat. He attacks Ryan with Drannith and Zach with Siren Storm Tamer. They both take it, Ob Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Cal exiles Sulphurous Springs. In his second main phase, Drake pays 2 and draws 2 through Timna. He plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, paying a life. Ob Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Cal exiles Opposition Agent off of the top of his library. Then Drake fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. Drake passes. At the end of Drake's turn, Ryan casts Tainted Pact. He exiles until he finds Diabolic Intent, putting it into his hand. The turn moves to Ryan. During Ryan's upkeep, he reveals Jessica's Will through Dark Confidant and loses 3 life. During his draw step, he takes a damage through his Mana Vault. Ob Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Cal exiles Scalding Tarn. Ryan moves to combat and attacks Drake with Ragavan. Drake takes it, Ragavan triggers, Ryan creates a treasure, and Drake exiles Notion Thief. In his second main phase, Ryan casts Diabolic Intent, sacrificing Ragavan as an additional cost. He fetches up a card into his hand. He casts a Soul Ring. Lotho triggers, and Drake loses a life and creates a treasure. Ob Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Cal exiles a Mana Vault. Ryan casts an Overloaded Dam. In response, Zach taps Soul Ring for 2 colorless and activates his Goblin Engineer, sacrificing Soul Ring and putting Jeweled Lotus from his graveyard onto the battlefield. Still in response to Dam, Drake hardcasts Force of Will. In response to Force, Zach casts Frantic Search, drawing 2, discarding 2, and untapping 2 lands. Zach then casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting only Force of Will. Lotho triggers, and Drake loses a life and creates a treasure. Ob Nixilis triggers, gets another counter, and Cal exiles Twin Flame. Mindbreak Trap resolves, exiling Force, then Dam resolves, wiping the board. Ryan plays a Bloodstained Mire as his land for turn. He casts his commander, Timna the Weaver. Having completely altered the board state and staved off death by Ob Nixilis, Ryan ends his turn. Zach draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He passes. Cal draws and casts Mana Vault from exile. He casts Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He recasts his commander, Ob Nixilis. In response, Ryan cracks his Bloodstained Mire, pays a life, and fetches up a Godless Shrine onto the battlefield tapped. Then Ob Nixilis resolves. Cal plays a Sulphurous Springs from exile. He casts Opposition Agent from exile. He casts Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. After refilling his board, Cal passes. Drake draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He casts Dothy Voidwalker. He ends his turn. During his draw step, Ryan takes a damage from his Mana Vault. Ob Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Cal exiles a Lion's Eye Diamond. In his main phase, Ryan casts his other commander, Jessica, Thrice Reborn. He activates Jessica's first ability, targeting Timna. Ryan moves to combat and attacks Drake with Timna. Drake takes 6, and Ryan gains 6. In his second main phase, Ryan pays 1 and draws 1 through Timna. Ob Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Cal exiles Demonic Tutor. Ryan plays a Mana Confluence. He casts Grand Abolisher. Ryan ends his turn. Zach draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He sacrifices his Jeweled Lotus to help cast his commander, Niv-Mizzet Parun. Zach passes. During his draw step, Cal takes a damage from his mana ball. In his main phase, he casts Defense Grid. He then casts Yawgmoth's Will. Niv-Mizzet triggers, Zach draws, and he deals a damage to Ragavan, killing it. Will resolves, and Cal casts Firebrand Archer from his graveyard. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond from exile. He cracks his LED, discards his hand into exile, and adds 3 black. He casts Demonic Tutor. Archer and Niv-Mizzet trigger. In response to the triggers, Cal casts Vampiric Tutor from his graveyard. Archer and Niv-Mizzet trigger again, Zach draws, Niv triggers, and deals a damage to Archer, killing it. Archer's trigger then resolves, dealing 1 to each of Cal's opponents. Ob-Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Cal exiles Jeska's Will. Then Vampiric Tutor resolves, and Cal fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. The first Niv-Mizzet trigger resolves, Zach draws, and deals 1 damage to Grand Abolisher. Then the first Archer trigger resolves and deals 1 to each of Cal's opponents. Ob-Nixilis triggers, gets a counter, and Cal exiles what he searched for, Dockside Extortionist, off of the top of his library. Then Demonic Tutor resolves, and Cal fetches up a card into his hand. He plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts Rite of Flame from his graveyard. Niv-Mizzet triggers, Zach draws, and deals a damage to Grand Abolisher, killing it. Then Cal adds 2 red. He taps Mana Confluence to help cast Jeska's Will, targeting Zach. Niv-Mizzet triggers, Zach draws, and deals a damage to Dauthi Voidwalker. Jeska's Will resolves, Cal adds 7 red, and exiles 2 lands at a Keterek Parasite. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters, and in response, Drake and Ryan crack their treasures. Then Cal creates 6 treasures. He casts Magda, Brazen Outlaw. He activates Magda, sacrificing 5 treasures, fetching up a Cloudstone Curio onto the battlefield. He casts Dragon's Rage Channeler from his graveyard. Curio triggers, and Cal returns Dockside to his hand. Cal presents a loop of casting Dockside to bounce Darcy, then using Darcy to bounce Dockside, creating infinite treasures. He then activates Magda again to search up Witchclaw Talisman onto the battlefield. He activates Witchclaw, fetching up a card into his hand and giving Witchclaw to Zach. Cal casts Mayhem Devil. With treasures abound, Cal sacrifices his treasures, pinging his opponents to death, and Cal wins the game. John wins the sleepover pillow fight and gets to start us off. John draws and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Wizard as it enters. He casts a Soul Ring. He passes. Zach draws and plays an Island. He casts a Lotus Petal. He ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays a Prismatic Vista. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a forest onto the battlefield. He casts an Elvish Mystic. He ships the turn to Zeb. Zeb draws, plays a Misty Rainforest, and passes. John draws and taps his Cavern of Souls to help cast an uncounterable Baral, Chief of Compliance. He plays a Polluted Delta. He gives the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He ships the turn. At the end of Zach's turn, Zeb cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. Brandon draws and plays a Forest. He casts his commander, Marwyn the Nurturer. He passes. Zeb draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He casts Talisman of Creativity. He ends his turn. At the end of Zeb's turn, John cracks his Polluted Delta, pays a life, and fetches up a Snow-Covered Island onto the battlefield. He casts Brainstorm, drawing 3 and putting 2 back on top. The turn moves to John. John draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He corrects it, pays a life, and fetches up an island onto the battlefield. He casts a Lotus Petal. He taps his Cavern of Souls to help cast his commander, Azami, Lady of Scrolls. He activates Azami, tapping her to draw a card. He activates her again, tapping Baral to draw a card. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. He gives the turn to Zach. At the end of John's turn, Zach casts Snap, targeting Azami. In response, John casts Dispel, targeting Snap. In response, Zeb taps his Talisman to cast Swan Song, targeting Dispel. Swan Song resolves, Dispel is countered, and John creates a 2/2 bird. Snap then resolves, Azami is bounced, and Zach untaps 2 lands. The turn moves to Zach. Zach draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He casts Mystic Remora. In response, John casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, targeting Remora. In response, Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life, and exiling a blue card, targeting Force of Negation. Force of Negation is countered, and Mystic Remora resolves. Zach casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Zach creates 2 whole treasures. The table asks what he's gonna do with all that coin, and Zach tells them that he's gonna pass the turn. Brandon draws and plays a Forest. He casts a Kicked Vines of Vastwood, targeting Marwyn. Remora triggers, and Zach draws. Vines resolves, and Marwyn gets +4/+4. He taps Marwyn for 5 green, and then casts Shared Summons. Remora triggers, Zach draws, and then Brandon fetches up a Shaya, Soul of the Wild, and a Wirewood Symbiote into his hand. He casts Wirewood Symbiote. He taps his Elvish Mystic, floating a green, and then activates Wirewood Symbiote, returning Mystic to hand, untapping Marwyn. He recasts Elvish Mystic. It enters, and Marwyn gets a +1/+1 counter. He taps Marwyn for 6 green. He casts Woodland Bellower. In response, Zeb casts a very dangerous Pact of Negation. Remora triggers, and Zach draws. Pact resolves, and Bellower is countered. Brandon ships the turn to Zeb. During Zeb's upkeep, Pact of Negation triggers. He doesn't have enough mana to pay, so in response, he casts Dark Ritual, and Zach draws. Then Zeb adds 3 black and taps his Talisman to help pay for Pact of Negation. The table admires Zeb's bravery as he draws for turn. He plays a Crystal Vein and passes. John draws and plays an island. He taps his Cavern of Souls to help cast Azami, Lady of Scrolls. He taps her to draw a card. He taps Baral to draw a card. He passes. During its upkeep, Zach pays to keep his Remora. He draws, and in his first main phase, Urza's Saga gets a final counter, and he sacrifices it. He fetches up a Jeweled Lotus onto the battlefield. He cracks it to help cast his commander, Niv-Mizzet Parun. He ends his turn. Brandon draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps Ancient Tomb and floats mana from his other permanents. He activates Wirewood Symbiote, bouncing Elvish Mystic to untap Marwyn. He recasts Elvish Mystic. It enters and gives Marwyn a counter. He casts Invasion of Ikoria, where X equals 7, targeting Zeb. Remora triggers and Zach draws. Niv triggers and deals 1 damage to Wirewood Symbiote, killing it. In response, Zach casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Invasion. Niv triggers, Zach draws, and Niv pings Elvish Mystic, killing it. Fierce Guardianship resolves, and Invasion is countered. Brandon gives the turn to Zeb. Zeb draws and casts Aether Channeler. It enters and bounces Niv-Mizzet, and all his Eminence triggers, and Zeb pays 1 to create a token copy of Channeler with haste. It enters and bounces Azami. Zeb moves to combat and attacks Brandon with his Channeler copy. Brandon takes the hit, Zeb ends his turn, exiling the Channeler. John draws and plays a Reliquary Tower. He taps his Cavern of Souls to help recast Azami. He taps her to draw a card. He taps Baral to draw a card. He gives the turn to Zach. During Zach's upkeep, he lets his Mystic Remora die. He draws and casts Ponder. He looks at the top 3, rearranges, and draws. He plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts Red Elemental Blast, targeting Azami. In response, John casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card, targeting Red Blast. In response, Zach casts Misdirection, exiling a blue card, targeting Force of Will. Misdirection resolves and changes the target of Force of Will to Misdirection itself. Force of Will fizzles and Red Elemental Blast resolves, killing Azami. Zach passes the turn. Brandon draws and plays a Forest. He casts Mana Vault. He ships the turn to Zeb. Zeb draws and, liking what Brandon did this turn, casts his own Mana Vault. He passes. John draws and casts Merchant Scroll, fetching up a Frantic Search into his hand. He casts Frantic Search. He draws 2, discards 2, and untaps 3 lands. He uses his blue from his Cavern of Souls to cast Trinket Mage. It enters and he fetches up a Mana Crypt into his hand. He casts Mana Crypt. John ends his turn. Zach draws and plays an island. He ships the turn to Brandon. Brandon draws and taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Ashaya, Soul of the Wild. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with Marwyn. Zeb takes the hit, and Brandon passes the turn. At the end of Brandon's turn, Zeb casts Essence Flux, targeting his Aether Channeler. Channeler blinks, Zeb draws a card, and all his Eminence triggers, Zeb pays 1, creates a copy of Channeler, it enters, and Zeb draws again. The turn moves to Zeb. Zeb draws and casts Talisman of Indulgence. He passes, and his Channeler copy is exiled. During its upkeep, John loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and then taps his Cavern of Souls to help cast Azami, Lady of Scrolls. In response, Zach delves 6 to help cast Dig Through Time. He looks at the top 7, putting 2 into his hand and the rest on bottom. Then Azami resolves. John taps Azami to draw a card. He taps Trinket Mage to draw a card. He taps Baral to draw a card. He plays an island for turn. He ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Steam Vents onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Phantasmal Image. In response, John casts Mana Drain, targeting Image. In response, Zach casts Miscast, targeting Mana Drain. Miscast resolves, Mana Drain is countered, and then Phantasmal Image resolves. It enters as a copy of Dockside Extortionist, and Zach creates 6 treasures. He recasts his commander, Niv-Mizzet Parun. In response, Zeb taps his Talisman to help cast Ad Nauseam. With no answers, Ad Naus resolves. Zeb reveals the Thassa's Oracle, Steam Vents, Rhystic Study, Blue Elemental Blast, Arid Mesa, Force of Will, Vampiric Tutor, Rite of Flame, and a Dockside Extortionist, deciding to stop there. Then Niv-Mizzet resolves. Zach ends his turn. Brandon draws and casts a Summoner's Pact. Zach draws through Niv-Mizzet and pings Azami for 1. Summoner's Pact resolves, and Brandon fetches up an Eternal Witness into his hand. He casts Eternal Witness. In response, Zeb casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Witness. Niv triggers, and Zach draws, then pings Azami again, killing her. Force of Will resolves, and Eternal Witness is countered. Brandon gives the turn to Zeb. During Zeb's upkeep, he casts Vampiric Tutor. Niv triggers, and then Zach draws, then pings Zeb for 1. In response, Brandon taps his Ancient Tomb to help hardcast Invigorate, targeting Marwyn. Zach draws through Niv and pings Zeb. Invigorate resolves, giving Marwyn +4/+4 until the end of turn. Still in response, Zeb casts Blue Elemental Blast, targeting Niv. Zach draws through Niv and then pings Zeb, then Blue Elemental Blast resolves, destroying Niv-Mizzet Parun. Then Vampiric Tutor resolves, and Zeb fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He draws, and during his draw step, he takes a damage through his Mana Vault. He plays a Steam Vents into play untapped, paying 2 life. He taps his Talisman to help cast Thassa's Oracle. In response, John casts Pact of Negation, targeting Thoracle. Pact resolves, Oracle is countered, Baral triggers, and then John draws and discards. Next, Zeb taps his Talisman to help cast Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Zeb creates 3 treasures. He does the unthinkable and casts Simian Spirit Guide. Zeb passes the turn. During his upkeep, John wins his Mana Crypt roll and then pays for his Pact of Negation. Still in his upkeep, he casts Mystical Tutor, fetching up a Temporal Mastery onto the top of his library. He draws Temporal Mastery and casts it for its miracle cost, getting an extra turn. He plays a Cephalid Colosseum. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with his bird. Zeb takes the hit, and John passes the turn to, well, himself. During his upkeep, John loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and then activates his Cephalid Colosseum, sacrificing it to draw 3 and discard 3. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with his bird. Zeb takes the hit, and in his second main phase, John casts Capture of Jingxiao, taking an extra turn. John gives the turn to himself. Again. During his upkeep, John loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zeb with his bird. Zeb takes the hit, and in his second main phase, John casts a Time Twister. Each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library, then draws 7. John casts Teferi's Ageless Insight. He casts a Brainstorm. He draws 6 cards through Ageless Insight, and then puts 2 back on top. He casts a Lotus Petal. He plays a Cephalid Colosseum. He taps his Colosseum to help cast Merchant Scroll. He fetches up a Frantic Search into his hand. He casts Frantic Search, drawing 4, discarding 2, and untapping 2 of his lands. He casts Snapcaster Mage. It enters, giving Frantic Search flashback. John flashes back Frantic Search from his graveyard, drawing 4, discarding 2, and untapping 3 lands. He casts Mistcaller. Unable to produce a victory, he reluctantly ends his turn. Zach draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He casts a Brainstorm. He draws 3 and puts 2 back on top. He cracks his Wooded Foothills, pays a life, and fetches up a mountain onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Grafdigger's Cage. He casts a Goblin Engineer. It enters, and he fetches up a Jeweled Lotus into his graveyard. He gives the turn to Brandon. At the end of Zach's turn, Brandon casts Worldly Tutor. In response, John casts Dispel, targeting Tutor. Worldly Tutor is countered, Baral triggers, John draws 2 through Teferi's Ageless Insight, and then discards a card. The turn moves to Brandon. During its upkeep, Brandon taps his Ancient Tomb to help pay for his Summoner's Pact. He draws and casts Teamer Sabertooth. In response, John casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Teamer Sabertooth. Force of Will resolves, Sabertooth is countered, Baral triggers, then John draws 2 and discards a card. Next, Brandon casts Hyrex Tower Scout. He casts Priest of Titania. It enters, and Marwyn gets a counter. He casts Wirewood Symbiote. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with a Shia. Zeb blocks with Simian Spirit Guide dies, and then Brandon ends his turn. During his upkeep, Zeb sacrifices his Crystal Vein to help untap his Mana Vault. He then casts a Mystical Tutor, fetching up a Step Through onto the top of his library. He draws for turn and plays an Underground Sea. He Wizard cycles Step Through, discarding it and fetching up a Scholar of Ages into his hand. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Dockside as an additional cost, adding 4 black. He casts Scholar of Ages. In response, John activates the Cephalid Colosseum, sacrificing it, drawing 6, and discarding 3. He casts Pact of Negation, targeting Scholar. Scholar is countered, Baral triggers, John draws 2, and discards a card. With nothing else, Zeb ships the turn. During his upkeep, John wins his Mana Crypt roll and then pays for his Pact of Negation. He draws and casts Phantasmal Image. In response, Zach casts Delay, targeting Image. In response, John casts Swansong, targeting Delay. In response, Zach casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Swansong. Swansong is countered, and still in response, John casts his own Delay, targeting Zach's Delay. Delay resolves, Zach's Delay is countered and exiled with 3 time counters on it. Baral triggers, and John draws 2 and discards a card. Then Phantasmal Image resolves and enters as a copy of Dockside Extortionist. John creates 7 treasures. He casts Fabricate, fetching up a Jeweled Lotus into his hand. He casts Jeweled Lotus. He cracks it to help cast his commander, Azami. He taps his Trinket Mage through Azami to draw 2. He taps Baral to draw 2. He taps Mistcaller to draw 2. He taps Azami to draw 2. He taps Snapcaster to, you guess it, draw 2. He pays 2 life to cast Gitaxian Probe. He looks at Zach's hand and then draws 2 cards. He moves to combat and attacks Zeb with his bird. Zeb takes it and dies. In his second main phase, John plays an island. He casts Curse Catcher. He taps it through Azami to draw 2. With quite a healthy hand, he passes the turn to Zach. During Zach's upkeep, he removes the time counter from a Delay, and then wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays an island. He activates Goblin Engineer, sacrificing his Mana Crypt to return Jeweled Lotus to the battlefield. He recasts Niv-Mizzet Parun. He ends his turn. During his draw step, Brandon takes a damage through his Mana Vault. He plays a Wooded Foothills for turn. He taps his Ancient Doom to help cast Force of Vigor, targeting Grafdigger's Cage and Teferi's Ageless Insight. Niv triggers, Zach draws, and then he targets Curse Catcher with the ping. In response, John activates Curse Catcher, sacrificing it, targeting Force of Vigor. Brandon pays for the Curse Catcher, Niv's ping fizzles, and still in response, John casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card and targeting Force of Vigor. Niv triggers, Zach draws, and Niv pings Snapcaster Mage, killing it. In response, Brandon casts Invigorate for its alternate cost, having Zach gain 4 life and targeting Marwyn. Zach draws and pings Wirewood Symbiote through Niv, killing it. Invigorate resolves, giving Marwyn +4/+4 until the end of turn. Force of Negation finally resolves, countering and exiling Force of Vigor. Baral triggers and John draws 2 and discards 1. Brandon moves to combat and attacks John with a Shia. John chump blocks with Dockside Extortionist, it dies, and then Brandon ships the turn to John. At the end of Brandon's turn, Zach casts Rapid Hybridization, targeting Azami. Zach draws through Niv-Mizzet and pings Mistcaller with the ping. In response, John activates Mistcaller, sacrificing it, fizzling the ping. In response to her hybridization, John pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, targeting hybridization. Zack draws and pings Trinket Mage through Niv-Mizzet. In response, Zack casts Submerge for its alternate cost, targeting Baral. Zack draws and pings Trinket Mage with Niv, killing it. Submerge resolves and bounces Baral to the top of his library. Still in response, Zack then casts Miscast, targeting Mental Misstep. Zack draws and pings John with Niv. In response, John casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Zack's spells. Zack draws and pings John through Niv. In response, Zack casts Deflecting Swat for its alternate cost, targeting Mindbreak Trap. Zack draws and pings John through Niv again. Deflecting Swat resolves and changes the targets of Mindbreak Trap to Mental Misstep. Mindbreak Trap resolves, Mental Misstep is exiled, Miscast fizzles, Rapid Hybridization resolves, Azami is destroyed, and John creates a 3/3 Frog Lizard. After all that, the turn finally moves to John. During his upkeep, John loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He moves to combat and attacks Brandon with his bird. Brandon takes the hit, and in his second main phase, John taps his Cavern of Souls to help cast Cyclone Summoner. It enters and returns all non-giant, non-wizard, non-land permanents to their owner's hands. John delves 8 to help cast Temporal Trespass. Zack draws and pings John through Niv, and then Temporal Trespass resolves. John casts Sapphire Medallion. He casts the Soul Ring. John passes to himself. John draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He casts Capture of Jing Chao. Zack draws and pings John through Niv. John casts Evacuation. Zack draws and pings John through Niv again, and then all creatures are bounced to their owner's hand. John plays an island. He casts Intruder Alarm. He passes the turn to himself. John draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga triggers. He floats mana and sacrifices it, fetching up a Mox Opal onto the battlefield. He casts Nexus of Fate. John gets an extra turn and shuffles Nexus back into his library. He casts Baral, Chief of Compliance. He casts Teferi's Ageless Insight. He casts Library of Ling. He gives the turn to himself, completing a full John turn cycle. John draws and casts Mind Over Matter. He casts a Mana Crypt. He activates Mind Over Matter, discarding a card to untap a snow-covered island. He taps his Cavern of Souls to help cast Azami, Lady of Scrolls. He presents a loop of tapping Azami to draw 2 cards through Teferi's Ageless Insight, discarding a card to untap her through Mind Over Matter, and then repeating this until he has drawn his whole library. He discards 2 cards through Mind Over Matter to untap 2 lands, and then he casts Laboratory Maniac. He taps Laboratory Maniac through Azami to draw 2 cards, and with no cards left in his library, John wins the game. Zeb won the What the Fluff challenge and gets to start us off. Zeb draws a card for turn and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Scrubland onto the battlefield. He casts a Lotus Petal. He cracks it to cast his commander, Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. Zeb passes. Alana draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plateau onto the battlefield. She casts a Mana Crypt and passes the turn. Emma draws, plays an Exotic Orchard, and passes to Nabil. Nabil draws and plays a Polluted Delta. They crack it, pay a life, and fetch up a Bayou onto the battlefield. They cast a Mana Crypt. Nabil ends their turn. Zeb draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Godless Shrine onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He moves to combat and attacks Nabil with Lotho. Nabil takes it, and Zeb ships the turn. During her upkeep, Alana wins her Mana Crypt roll. She draws and passes. Emma draws and plays a Teleria West into play tapped. She passes. At the end of Emma's turn, Nabil casts Vampiric Tutor. They fetch up a card onto the top of their library and lose 2 life. The turn moves to Nabil. During their upkeep, Nabil wins their Mana Crypt roll. Nabil draws and casts Wall of Roots. They add a counter to Wall of Roots, adding a green. They cast Elves of Deep Shadow. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Nabil ends their turn. Zeb draws and plays a Plains. He casts Recruiter of the Guard. It enters and Zeb fetches up an Esper Sentinel into his hand. He casts Esper Sentinel. Lotho triggers and he loses a life and creates a treasure. Next, Zeb convokes Benny Brax, Zoologist. He moves to his end step, draws from Benny Brax, and the turn moves to Alana. During her upkeep, Alana wins her Mana Crypt roll. She draws, misses her land drop, and passes the turn. Emma draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. She casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Emma creates 3 treasures. Emma ends her turn. During their upkeep, Nabil wins their Mana Crypt roll. Nabil draws and casts Expedition Map. Esper triggers and Nabil taps Elves of Deep Shadow to pay. They sack Expedition Map and fetch up a Savannah into their hand. They play Savannah for turn. They cast Esper Sentinel. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Nabil passes. At the end of Nabil's turn, Zeb draws a card from Benny Brax. Zeb draws and plays a City of Brast. He casts a Mana Crypt, paying for Esper. He casts Buried Alive. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. In response, Emma casts Mana Drain. Esper triggers and Zeb and Nabil draw. Then Mana Drain counters Buried Alive. Next, Zeb casts Sacrifice, sacrificing Recruiter of the Guard as an additional cost, adding 3 black. He casts Animate Dead. It enters and Zeb returns Recruiter of the Guard onto the battlefield. It enters and Zeb fetches up a Lurrus of the Dream Den into his hand. He casts Lurrus. He casts Lotus Petal from his graveyard through Lurrus. Zeb moves to his end step, draws from Benny Brax, and passes to Alana. During her upkeep, Alana wins her mana crypt roll. She draws and casts a Grinding Station. Esper triggers and Zeb and Nabil draw. She activates Grinding Station, sacrificing itself and milling 3. Alana ships the turn. Emma draws, and in her first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. She also adds 3 colorless through mana drain. She casts Ponder. Esper triggers and Zeb and Nabil draw. Then Emma looks at the top 3, rearranges, and draws. She plays a mountain for turn. Emma passes. During their upkeep, Nabil wins their mana crypt roll. Nabil draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. They crack it, pay a life, and fetch up a Temple Garden onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. Nabil taps Elves of Deep Shadow to help cast their commander, Tayam Luminous Enigma. They add a counter to Wall of Roots, adding a green. Nabil ships the turn to Zeb. During his upkeep, Zeb loses his mana crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Demonic Tutor, paying for Esper. He fetches up a card into his hand. He plays a Marsh Flats for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a swamp onto the battlefield. He taps his City of Brass to help cast Abdel Adrian, Gorian's Ward. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Abdel enters and Zeb exiles Mana Crypt and Recruiter of the Guard, creating 2 soldiers. He casts a Lotus Petal from his graveyard through Lurrus. In response, Emma casts Pongify, targeting Lurrus. Esper triggers, Emma pays for Zeb, and Nabil draws. Then Lurrus is destroyed and Zeb creates an ape. With nothing else, Zeb moves to his end step, draws from Benny Brax, and ships the turn to Alana. During her upkeep, Alana wins her Mana Crypt roll. She draws and casts Curse Mirror. Esper triggers and Zeb and Nabil draw. It enters as a copy of Dockside Extortionist. Dockside enters and Alana creates 8 treasures. She casts Smothering Tithe. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Alana passes the turn. Emma draws and pays for Smothering Tithe. In her main phase, Urza Saga triggers. Emma sacrifices it, fetching up a Jeweled Lotus onto the battlefield. She plays a Shatter Skull to hammer pass and to play untapped, paying 3 life. She cracks her Lotus to help cast her commander, Niv-Mizzet Parun. Emma passes. At the end of Emma's turn, Nabil adds a counter to Wall of Roots, adding a green. They activate Tayam, removing 3 counters from Wall of Roots, milling 3, and returning Tyvar, Jubilant Brawler, to the battlefield. The turn moves to Nabil. During their upkeep, Nabil loses their Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. They draw, Tithe triggers, and Alana creates a treasure. In their main phase, Nabil casts a Soul Ring, paying the Esper tax. They cast a Cation Money Changer. Lotho triggers, and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. In response, Alana casts Soul Partition, targeting Tayam. Esper, and Niv trigger. They each draw, Smothering Tide triggers, and Alana creates 3 treasures. Niv triggers and deals 1 to Lotho, killing it. Then Tayam is exiled, Money Changer enters, gets 3 counters, and deals 3 damage to Nabil. Next, Nabil activates Tybar's second ability, milling 3 and returning Devoted Druid to the battlefield. They add a counter to Wall of Roots, adding a green. They cast 1000-Year Elixir. Nabil passes the turn. Zeb draws, Tide triggers, and Alana creates a treasure. Zeb plays a Silent Clearing for turn. He casts Eldrazi Displacer. He casts Mox Amber, paying for Esper. He taps City of Brass to help cast Kambal, Console of Allocation. He moves to combat and attacks Nabil for 12. Nabil takes it, and Zeb passes. At the end of Zeb's turn, Alana casts Mystical Tutor. Niv-Mizzet, Esper, and Kambal all trigger. Alana loses 2 life and Zeb gains 2 life. Zeb draws, Tide triggers, Alana creates a treasure. Nabil draws, Tide triggers again. Nabil pays. Emma draws, Niv and Tide trigger. Alana creates a treasure, and Niv pings Nabil's Esper Sentinel, killing it. Then Alana fetches up a Wheel of Fortune onto the top of her library. The turn moves to Alana. During her upkeep, Alana loses her Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. She draws and casts her commander, Elsha of the Infinite. In response, Zeb casts Reprieve. Niv triggers, and in response, Alana casts Swansong, targeting Reprieve. Niv, Esper, and Kambal trigger. Alana loses 2 and Zeb gains 2. Zeb draws through Esper. Tide triggers. Alana creates a treasure. Emma draws. Niv and Tide trigger. Alana creates a treasure again. Then Niv pings Devoted Druid. Then Swansong counters Reprieve. Zeb creates a 2/2 bird. Emma draws through Niv. Alana creates a treasure. Then Niv pings Devoted Druid, killing it. Then finally, Elsha resolves. Next, Alana casts Jessica's Will from the top of her library through Elsha. Elsha, Niv, and Kambal trigger. Alana loses 2 and Zeb gains 2. Emma draws. Alana creates a treasure. Niv pings Esper Sentinel, killing it, and Elsha gets +1/+1. In response, Emma casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting Jessica's Will. Niv and Kambal trigger. Emma loses 2 and Zeb gains 2. Emma draws and pings Elsha. In response, Alana casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Mindbreak Trap. Niv and Kambal trigger. Alana loses 2 and Zeb gains 2. Emma draws through Niv. Alana creates a treasure through Tithe, and Niv pings Elsha for 1. In response, Emma casts Misdirection for its alternate cost, exiling a blue card, targeting Fierce. Niv and Kambal trigger. Emma loses 2 and Zeb gains 2. Emma draws. Tide triggers. Alana creates a treasure, and Niv pings Elsha. In response, Nabil taps his Elves of Deep Shadow and pays 4 life to help cast Dismember, targeting Niv-Mizzet. Kambal and Niv trigger. Emma draws. Alana creates a treasure through Tide. Then Nabil loses 2 and Zeb gains 2. In response, Emma casts Miscast, targeting Dismember. Niv and Kambal trigger. Emma loses 2 and Zeb gains 2. Emma draws. Alana creates a treasure, and Niv pings Elsha. In response, Alana casts Muddle the Mixture, targeting Miscast. Elsha, Niv, and Kambal trigger. Alana loses 2 and Zeb gains 2. Emma draws. Alana creates a treasure. Niv pings Elsha, and with the Elsha Prowess trigger still in the stack, Emma casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, targeting Muddle the Mixture. Niv and Cabal trigger, and in response, Nabil adds a counter to Wall of Roots, adding a green. They channel Beseiju, who endures, targeting Smothering Tithe. Tithe is destroyed, and Alana fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. Then Emma loses 2 and Zeb gains 2. Emma draws through Niv, and then pings Elsha. In response, Emma casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Kambal. Niv and Kambal trigger, Emma loses 2 and Zeb gains 2. Emma draws, and Niv triggers, targeting Elsha. In response, Alana casts Izzet Signet through Elsha. Elsha and Kambal trigger, Alana loses 2 and Zeb gains 2, then Elsha gets +1/+1. Signet resolves, then Niv pings Elsha, then Lightning Bolt kills Kambal. Then Fierce counters Muddle, Elsha gets +1/+1, Miscast counters Dismember, and with Misdirection still on the stack, Alana casts Underworld Breach off of the top of her library through Elsha. Elsha triggers and gets +1/+1. With no other answers, Breach resolves. Alana escapes Swan Song, targeting Misdirection. Elsha and Niv trigger, Emma draws, Niv pings Alana, and Elsha gets +1/+1. Then Swan Song counters Misdirection, Emma creates a 2/2 bird, Fierce counters Mindbreak Trap, and after all of that, Jessica's will finally resolves. Alana adds 10 red and exiles Rhystic Study, Savine's Reclamation, and Unwinding Clock. Alana escapes Soul Partition, targeting Niv. Niv triggers, Emma draws, pings Alana, then Niv is exiled. Alana escapes Grinding Station. It enters, triggers, and in response, Alana activates Grinding Station, sacrificing Mana Crypt, milling 3. Then Grinding Station untaps. Alana presents a loop of escaping Mana Crypt, tapping it for mana, then sacking it to Grinding Station, milling 3. She does this over and over until she mills Mox Opal. She repeats this process with Mox Opal, tapping it for blue. She mills her entire deck. She casts Jace, Wielder of Mysteries from her hand. She activates Jace's first ability, attempts to draw from an empty library, and Alana wins the game. Nick won the Blackout Challenge and gets to start us off. Nick draws a card for turn and plays a Misty Rainforest. He passes. Peter draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts a Mana Crypt. He taps his City of Brass to help cast Rhystic Study. In response, Nick casts Force of Will, paying a life, exiling a blue card, countering Rhystic. Peter passes. Ashani draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He casts a Mana Crypt. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a volcanic island onto the battlefield. He ends his turn. Zach draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding City of Traders. He exiles Simeon Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Rhystic Study. Peter groans, Study resolves, and Zach ships the turn to Nick. At the end of Zach's turn, Nick cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. Nick draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts Imperial Seal. Rhystic triggers, and Nick taps the City of Brass to pay for it. Then Nick fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Nick ends his turn. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and then taps his City of Brass to help cast out Mystic Remora, paying the Rhystic tax. Peter passes. During his upkeep, Ashani loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Gamble. Rhystic and Mystic trigger, and Peter and Zach draw. Then Ashani fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Mana Confluence. He plays a City of Brass for turn. He taps it to help cast a Rhystic Study of his own. Peter and Zach draw, then Rhystic resolves. All through, Ashani passes. Zach draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He casts Drannith Magistrate. Rhystic triggers and Ashani draws. Drannith resolves and Zach ships the turn. Nick draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps it to help cast Rhystic Study. Remora and 2 Rhystics trigger, and all 3 players draw. The table straps in, and Nick passes the turn. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He also taps his City of Brass to pay for his Remora. He draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Breeding Pool onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts an Ignoble Hierarch. 3 Rhystics trigger, Peter pays 2, and then Nick draws. With nothing else, Peter passes. During his upkeep, Ashani wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws, plays a Mountain, and passes the turn. Zach draws and plays a City of Brass. Zach ends his turn. Nick draws and passes. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He also pays to keep its Remora. He draws and taps the City of Brass to help cast Dothy Voidwalker. 3 Rhystics trigger, and all 3 players draw. Peter ends his turn. During his upkeep, Ashani wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Mountain. He casts a Izzet Signet. He pays for both Rhystics, and Peter draws through Remora. Ashani passes. Zach draws and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He casts his commander, Timna the Weaver, and both players draw from Rhystic. He moves to combat and attacks Peter with Drannith Magistrate. Peter takes it, and in his second main phase, Zach pays a life and draws a card through Timna. Zach gives the turn to Nick. Nick draws and taps his City of Brass to help cast Counterbalance. Mystic and 2 Rhystics trigger, and all 3 players draw. In response, Peter casts Swansong, and all 3 opponents draw again. Counterbalance is countered and exiled with a Void counter, and Nick creates a 2/2 bird. He plays a Polluted Delta for turn. He taps his Ancient Doom to help cast Talisman of Dominance, and all 3 opponents draw through Rhystic and Mystic. Finished up, Nick passes. During his upkeep, Peter lets his Remora die. He also wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Hallowed Fountain onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He taps the City of Brass to help cast Grand Abolishers. All Rhystic's trigger, and all 3 opponents draw. In response, Ashani casts Cyclonic Rift, targeting Zach's Rhystic. Both Rhystic's trigger, and Nick and Zach draw, then Zach's Rhystic is bounced. Then Abolisher resolves. Next, Peter casts Underworld Breach. He attempts to escape Mystic Remora, but Zach reminds him of the Drannith Magistrate on the battlefield. Peter sinks his head as he realizes what he just did. With nothing else to do, Peter passes, sacrificing Underworld Breach. During his upkeep, Ashani loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an island. He casts Gilded Drake. Rhystic triggers and Nick draws. In response, Nick cracks his Polluted Delta, pays a life, and fetches up a Watery Grave onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He taps his Talisman to help cast Drown in the Loch. Rhystic triggers and Ashani draws. In response, Ashani casts Muddle the Mixture, targeting Drown in the Loch. Rhystic triggers and Nick draws. In response, Peter casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Gilded Drake. Rhystic's trigger and Nick and Ashani draw. Force counters Drake, then Muddle counters Drown. Next, Ashani casts Dockside Extortionist, and Nick draws from Rhystic. Dockside enters, and Ashani creates 4 treasures. He casts Fabricate. Rhystic triggers, and Nick draws again. Then Ashani fetches up an Imposter Mech into his hand. He casts Imposter Mech, and Nick draws from Rhystic. Imposter Mech enters as a copy of Drannith Magistrate. He casts a Mox Amber, and Nick draws. Ashani passes. At the end of Ashani's turn, Zach cracks his Verdant Catacombs, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Mystical Tutor. Both Rhystic's trigger, and Ashani and Nick draw. Then Zach fetches up a Culling the Weak onto the top of his library. Ashani discards the hand size, and the turn moves to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Tymna as an additional cost. Both Rhystic's trigger, and Ashani and Nick draw. In response, Peter pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep. Rhystic's trigger, and both draw again. In response, Zach casts Swansong, targeting Misstep. Rhystic's trigger, and both draw again. Swansong counters Misstep. Peter creates a 2/2 bird, then Culling the Weak resolves, and Zach adds 4 black. He casts Ad Nauseam. Rhystic's trigger, and both players draw. In response, Nick casts Pact of Negation. Rhystic triggers, and Ashani draws. In response, Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card. Ashani and Nick draw from Rhystic, and in response, Peter casts Flusterstorm with all copies targeting Ad Nauseam. Rhystic triggers, and both draw. Ad Naus is countered, and Force counters Pact. Next, Zach taps the City of Brass to help cast Rhystic Study. Nick and Ashani draw through Rhystic, Zach's Rhystic resolves, and Zach ends his turn. During his upkeep, Nick casts Limdul's Vault. Both Rhystic's trigger, and Zach and Ashani draw. He looks at the top 5, doesn't like what he sees, pays a life, and continues the process. He does this 2 more times, paying 2 more life, then shuffling and rearranging the top 5. He draws and plays a Snow-Covered Island. He taps his City of Brass to help cast a Phantasmal Image. Rhystic trigger, and Zach and Ashani draw. In response, Ashani taps his City of Brass to help cast Stern Scolding. In response, Nick taps his Talisman to cast Spell Pierce, targeting Stern Scolding. Rhystic's trigger, and both draw again. In response, Peter casts Mindbreak Trap for its alternate cost, targeting all spells on the stack. Rhystic's trigger, and both players draw. All are exiled, then Nick follows up by casting Chrome Mox. Rhystic trigger, and both players draw. Chrome Mox enters, and Nick imprints Stern Scolding. He casts Mox Opal, and both draw again. He taps his Ancient Doom to cast an Arcane Signet, and both players draw from Rhystic. With nothing else, Nick passes, discarding the hand size into the Void Zone. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts Demonic Tutor. Rhystic triggers, and all 3 players draw. He fetches up a card into his hand. He casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside, creating 12 treasures. He taps the City of Brass to cast Cyclonic Rift, targeting Ashani's Drannith. Rhystic triggers, and all players draw again. Imposter Mech bounces, and then Peter casts Mayhem Devil. Each player draws through Rhystic, and Mayhem Devil resolves. Peter cracks 3 treasures, floating mana. Mayhem Devil triggers 3 times, killing Zach's Drannith. He casts his commander, Kenrith the Returned King. He sacrifices Dothy Voidwalker, casting Zach's Culling the Weak from exile, sacrificing Phantasmal Image as an additional cost, adding 4 black. He activates Kenrith's last ability, Reanimating Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside, creating 12 more treasures. He cracks 2 treasures, adding 2 green. Mayhem Devil triggers, pinging Zach for 2. He activates Kenrith's second ability, targeting Phantasmal Dockside. It triggers, and Peter sacrifices it. Mayhem Devil triggers, and deals 1 to Ashani. Peter presents a loop of Reanimated Image, creating treasures through Dockside, then sacrificing it through Kenrith's ability. Each time he cracks a treasure or sacrifices Image, he pings opponents through Mayhem Devil. He does this over and over, until the table is dead, and Peter wins the game. Tia won the Mirror Reflection Challenge, and gets to start us off. Tia draws a card for turn and plays a Forest. She casts a Mox Diamond, discarding a Gemstone Caverns. She casts a Felwar Stone. She passes. Emma draws and plays a Steam Vents, into play untapped, paying 2 life. She casts a Mox Diamond, discarding an Ancient Tomb. She casts Counterbalance. She passes. Johnny draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts Imperial Seal. Counterbalance triggers and Emma reveals a tandem Lookout. Then Johnny fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Johnny ends his turn. Zeb draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts a Soul Ring. Zeb passes to Tia. Tia draws and casts Birds of Paradise. She casts Goblin Bombardment. Tia ships the turn. Emma draws and casts a Mystic Remora. She passes to Johnny. Johnny draws and plays a Homeward Path. He casts a Null Rod. Remora and Counterbalance trigger. Emma reveals a Deflecting Swat, then draws a card. Johnny passes. Zeb draws and plays a Scrubland. He casts Drannith Magistrate. Counterbalance triggers and Emma reveals a Lotus Petal. Zeb passes. Tia draws, plays an Ancient Tomb, and ends the turn. During her upkeep, Emma pays to keep her Remora. She draws and passes to Johnny. Johnny draws, takes no actions, and passes the turn. Zeb draws and plays a Swamp. He casts his commander, Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. Counterbalance triggers, and Emma reveals a Gilded Drake, countering the spell. He moves to combat and attacks Emma with Drannith Magistrate. Emma takes it, and Zeb passes. Tia draws and plays an Otawara, Soaring City as her land for turn. She casts Narset, Parter of Veils. Counterbalance and Remora trigger. Emma draws, then reveals a Treasonous Ogre. Tia activates Narset's ability, looking at the top 4, revealing a Wild Growth into her hand. Tia ends her turn. At the end of Tia's turn, Johnny flashes in an Orcish Bowmasters. It enters and targets Birds of Paradise. In response, Tia activates Goblin Bombardment, sacrificing Birds of Paradise, killing Orcish Bowmasters. Then Johnny amasses 1. The turn moves to Emma. During her upkeep, Emma lets her Remora die. She draws and casts a Lotus Petal. She passes. Johnny draws and moves to combat. He attacks Emma with his Orc army. Emma takes it, and in his second main phase, Johnny casts Demonic Tutor. Counterbalance triggers, and Emma reveals a Mana Drain, countering the spell. Johnny passes. Zeb draws and casts a Mana Vault. He ships the turn. Tia draws and casts Wild Growth. She activates Narset's ability, looking at the top 4, revealing a Mana Vault into her hand. She taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Mana Vault. Tia ends her turn. Emma draws and passes, discarding to hand size. Johnny draws and casts Chains of Mephistopheles. Counterbalance triggers, and Emma reveals a Gush. He moves to combat and attacks Tia with his Orc army. Tia takes it, and Johnny passes to Emma. Zeb draws, takes no actions, and passes the turn. Tia draws and casts Elvish Mystic. Tia ends her turn. Emma draws and passes, discarding to hand size. Johnny draws and moves to combat. He attacks Emma with his Orc army. Emma takes it, and Johnny passes. Zeb draws and plays a Forbidden Orchard. He taps it, giving Emma a Spirit to help cast his commander, Lotho, Corrupt Sheriff. Counterbalance triggers, and Emma reveals a Mental Misstep. Zeb ships the turn. Tia draws and passes. At the end of Tia's turn, Johnny casts Consign, targeting Elvish Mystic. In response, Tia activates Goblin Bombardment, sacrificing Mystic and killing Johnny's Orc army. The turn moves to Emma. Emma draws and passes, discarding to hand size. Johnny draws and ends his turn. Zeb draws and casts Necropotence. Counterbalance triggers, and Emma reveals a Fierce Guardianship, countering the spell. Zeb sighs and passes the turn to Tia. Tia draws and casts a Jeweled Lotus. Tia passes. Emma draws, takes no actions, and passes, discarding to hand size. Johnny draws and casts Tetsuka Umizawa, Fugitive. Counterbalance triggers, and Emma reveals a Flusterstorm. Johnny passes. Zeb draws and plays a Bright Climb Pathway. Zeb ends his turn. Tia draws, takes no actions, and ships the turn to Emma. Emma draws and passes, discarding to hand size. Johnny draws and moves to combat. He attacks Zeb with Tetsuko. Zeb declares no blocks, and in response, Johnny Nichitsu's in Dokuchi Silencer, bouncing Tetsuko back to his hand. Before damage, Zeb casts Deadly Relic for its alternate cost, targeting Silencer. Counterbalance triggers, and Emma reveals a Wooded Foothills. Silencer is exiled, and Johnny gives the turn to Zeb. Zeb draws and casts a Bargain, Beseech the Mirror, sacrificing Mana Vault as an additional cost. Then Zeb fetches up a Savine's Reclamation into exile, casting it, targeting Necropotence in his graveyard. Lotho triggers, and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Then Zeb returns Necropotence to the battlefield. He activates Necropotence 10 times, paying 10 life, exiling 10 cards. Zeb moves to his end step, and Necropotence triggers. In response, Tia taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Snap, targeting Drannith Magistrate. Magistrate is bounced, and Tia untaps 2 lands. Still in response, Tia taps Ancient Tomb and uses her floating mana to cast an overloaded Cyclonic Rift. Lotho triggers, and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Then all of Tia's opponent's non-land permanents are bounced. Then Zeb puts the Necro cards into his hand. He passes, discarding to hand size. During Tia's upkeep, Zeb taps Forbidden Orchard, giving Emma a Spirit to cast Silence. In response, Tia hard casts Force of Will, countering the spell. During her draw step, she takes a damage from her Mana Vault. In her main phase, Tia casts her commander, Xyrus, the Writhing Storm. She taps Ancient Doom to help cast Sylvan Library. Tia passes. Emma draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. She casts a Lotus Petal. She casts a Gilded Drake. It enters and exchanges control of Tia's Xyrus. Emma gives the turn to Johnny. Johnny draws and recasts Tetsuko. Johnny ends his turn. Zeb draws and recasts his commander, Lotho. He casts a Soul Ring. Lotho triggers, and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. He casts Lurrus of the Dream Den. He casts Mana Vault from his graveyard through Lurrus. Zeb passes. During Tia's draw step, Sylvan Library and Mana Vault trigger. She takes a damage to her Mana Vault, and then draws 2 extra through Sylvan Library, paying 8 life to keep them both. Cyrus triggers and Emma creates 2 snakes. In her main phase, Tia plays a Taiga for turn. She taps her Ancient Tomb to help cast Glenhorn Buccaneer. She casts Mystic Remora. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Tia ships the turn to Emma. Emma draws and casts Counterbalance. Remora triggers and Tia draws. Cyrus triggers and Emma creates a snake. Emma ends her turn. Johnny draws and recasts Chains of Mephistopheles. Remora and Counterbalance trigger, Emma reveals a Spell Pierce, then Tia draws, Cyrus triggers and Emma creates a snake. Change resolves and Johnny passes. Zeb draws and plays a Silent Clearing. He flashes back Savine's Reclamation, targeting Necropotence in his graveyard. Remora triggers and Tia discards, then draws through Chains. Cyrus triggers and Emma creates a snake. Then Necropotence enters the battlefield. Zeb copies Savine's, returning Recruiter of the Guard from his graveyard to the battlefield. Recruiter enters and Zeb fetches up a Leonin Relic Warder into his hand. He taps Silent Clearing to cast Leonin Relic Warder. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Leonin enters, targeting his own Necropotence. In response, Zeb activates Necropotence 7 times, paying 7 life, exiling 7 cards. Then Warder exiles Necropotence. He casts Dance of the Dead from his graveyard through Lurrus. Remora triggers and Tia discards, then draws. Cyrus triggers and Emma creates a snake. Dance of the Dead enters and Zeb returns Kambal, Console of Allocation, from his graveyard to the battlefield. He moves to combat and attacks Johnny with Lurrus. Johnny takes it and Zeb gains 3. Zeb moves to his end step and puts the Necro cards into his hand. He passes, discarding to hand size. During her upkeep, Tia pays to keep her Remora. During her draw step, she takes a damage from her Mana Vault and then ignores her Sylvan Library trigger. In her main phase, she taps Ancient Tomb to help cast Imperial Recruiter. In enters and she fetches up a Malcolm, Keen-Eyed Navigator, into her hand. She plays a Cephalic Coliseum as her land for turn. She casts Malcolm. Lotho triggers and Zeb loses a life and creates a treasure. Tia moves to combat and, in response, Emma casts Submerge for its alternate cost, targeting Glenhorn Buccaneer. Kambal and Remora trigger, Tia discards then draws, Glenhorn and Cyrus triggers, Emma creates a snake and Glenhorn deals 1 damage to each opponent. Malcolm triggers and Tia creates 3 treasures. In response, Tia casts Veil of Summer. Counterbalance and Kambal triggers, Tia loses 2 and Zeb gains 2, then Emma reveals a Spell Pierce, countering the spell. With no other actions, Submerge resolves, putting Glenhorn onto the top of Tia's library. With nothing else, Tia passes to Emma. Emma draws and moves to combat. She attacks Tia with all 6 snakes and her spirit. Tia blocks 3 snakes and then takes the rest. Emma passes. Johnny draws and moves to combat. He attacks Narset with Tetsuko. Narset dies, and in his second main phase, Johnny cycles Windcaller Raven, discarding and drawing through Chains. Cyrus triggers and Emma creates a snake. He plays a Flooded Strand for turn. Johnny gives the turn to Zeb. During his draw step, Zeb takes a damage to his Mana Vault. In his main phase, he casts Unmarked Grave. Counterbalance triggers and Emma reveals an island. Remora triggers and, in response, Zeb casts Abeyance, targeting Emma. Counterbalance and Remora triggers and Tia discards and draws. Cyrus triggers and Emma creates a snake. In response to Counterbalance, Johnny cracks his Flooded Strand, pays a life, and fetches up a Watery Grave onto the battlefield untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Vampiric Tutor. Kambal and Remora triggers. Tia ignores Remora to keep the cards into her hand, then Johnny loses 2 and Zeb gains 2. Then Johnny fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Still in response, Emma casts Mystical Tutor. Kambal triggers and Emma loses 2 and Zeb gains 2. She fetches up a Snap onto the top of her library. Then Emma reveals a Snap through Counterbalance, countering Abeyance. Then Unmarked Grave resolves and Zeb fetches up a Corpse Knight into his graveyard. Next, Zeb flashes back Cabal Therapy, sacrificing Leonin Relic Warder, naming Glenhorn Buccaneer, targeting Tia. Relic Warder triggers and Zeb returns Necropotence to the battlefield. Remora triggers and Tia discards Glenhorn Buccaneer and draws. Cyrus triggers and Emma creates a snake. Then Tia reveals her hand and discards nothing. Zeb moves to combat and attacks Tia with Lotho, Lurrus, Recruiter, and Kambal. Tia blocks Kambal with Gilded Drake, Lurrus with Malcolm, and Lotho with Imperial Recruiter. Then Tia takes 1, Zeb gains 3, and the creatures die. In his second main phase, Zeb taps Silent Clearing and Forbidden Orchard, giving Emma a spirit to help cast the One Ring. Remora triggers and Tia ignores it. Ring enters and Zeb gains protection from everything. Zeb activates Necropotence 2 times, paying 2 life, exiling 2 cards. He moves to his end step and puts the Necro cards into his hand. Zeb passes the turn to Tia. During her upkeep, Tia lets her Remora die. She draws and ignores her Sylvan Library. She holds open mana and passes the turn. Emma draws and moves to combat. She attacks Johnny with 6 snakes. Johnny takes it and Emma passes. Johnny draws and casts out Mana Crypt. He moves to combat and attacks Emma with Tetsuko. In response, Johnny Nijitsu Zen Nashi Moon Sage's Scion, bouncing Tetsuko back to his hand. Emma takes it, Nashi triggers, and in response, Johnny casts Mystical Tutor. He fetches up a Temporal Trespass onto the top of his library. With Nashi's ability still in the stack, Zeb flashes in on Necromancy. It enters, and Zeb returns Drannith Magistrate to the battlefield. Then each player exiles the top card of their library. In his second main phase, Johnny plays a Steam Vents from exile through Nashi into play tapped. Johnny passes. At the end of Johnny's turn, Zeb activates the One Ring, adding a burden counter, then discarding and drawing through Chains, exiling the discarded card through Necropotence. Cyrus triggers and Emma creates a snake. Then Zeb sacrifices Necromancy, and the turn moves to Zeb. During his upkeep, Zeb loses a life to the One Ring. He skips his draw step due to Necropotence. In his main phase, he plays a Flooded Strand for turn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Plains onto the battlefield. He taps Silent Clearing to cast Vanishing Burst, targeting Counterbalance. Counterbalance triggers, and Emma reveals an Izzet Signet, countering the spell. Next, Zeb casts Eldrazi Displacer. He casts Reanimate, targeting Kambal in his graveyard. In response, Emma pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering the spell. He activates Necropotence 5 times, paying 5 life, exiling 5 cards. Zeb moves to his end step and puts the Necro cards into his hand. He passes to Tia. During her draw step, Tia takes a damage through her Mana Vault. In her main phase, she plays an Emergence Zone. Tia passes. Emma draws and casts Izzet Signet. She moves to combat and attacks Zeb with 7 snakes and 2 spirits. Zeb blocks 2 snakes and takes the rest. Emma ships the turn. During his upkeep, Johnny wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts Crippling Fear. In response, Tia activates Goblin Bombardment, sacrificing Gilded Drake, pinging Johnny for 1. Still in response, Zeb activates Eldrazi Displacer, flickering Nashi. Then Crippling Fear resolves, Johnny names Rat, and wipes most of the board. He recasts Tetsuko. Johnny ships the turn. During his upkeep, Zeb loses a life to the One Ring. He skips his draw step due to Necropotence. In his main phase, he plays an Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth as his land for turn. He casts a Mana Crypt. Counterbalance triggers, and Emma reveals a Forbidden Orchard, countering the spell. He casts Abdel Adrian, Gorian's Ward. Adrian enters, and Zeb exiles the One Ring, Necropotence, and Mana Vault, creating 3 soldiers. He casts a Springleaf Drum. He taps Silent Clearing 4 black through Urborg and Forbidden Orchard, giving Tia Spirit to help cast Academ's Awakening, where X equals 2. In response, Emma casts Flusterstorm, with all copies targeting Awakening, countering the spell. Zeb passes to Tia. During her draw step, Tia takes a damage through her Mana Vault. In her main phase, she plays a Command Tower. She casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Xyrus. Tia ships the turn. Emma draws and plays a Forbidden Orchard. She casts Treasonous Ogre. She pays 9 life through Ogre, adding 3 red. She casts Goblin Matron. It enters and she fetches up a Dockside Extortionist into her hand. She pays 6 life, adding 2 red to cast Dockside. Dockside enters and, in response, Tia cracks her treasures. Then Emma creates 10 treasures. She cracks treasures to help cast her commander, Niv-Mizzet Parun. Emma moves to combat and, in response, Tia casts March of Swirling Mist, targeting Emma Xyrus, Niv-Mizzet, and Abdel Adrian. All 3 phase out, and then Emma passes the turn. During his upkeep, Johnny wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Emma with Tetsuko. Emma declares no blocks, and in response, Johnny ninjutsus in his commander, Yuriko the Tiger Shadow, bouncing Tetsuko to his hand. Emma takes it, Yuriko triggers, and Johnny reveals a Mystic Remora into his hand, with each opponent losing 1. In his second main phase, Johnny recasts Tetsuko. Counterbalance triggers, and Emma reveals a Scalding Tarn. Johnny gives the turn to Zeb. Zeb draws and casts Yawgmoth's Will. In response, Johnny casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, countering the spell. Next, Zeb casts Peer into the Abyss. It resolves, and Zeb discards and draws 26 through Chains of Mephistopheles and loses half of his life. Xyrus triggers 26 times, and Tia creates 26 snakes. Zeb moves to combat and attacks John with Abdel and 2 soldiers. John blocks both soldiers and then takes the rest. Zeb passes the turn. At the end of Zeb's turn, Tia casts Worldly Tutor. In response, Johnny pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering the spell. The turn moves to Tia. Tia draws and moves to combat. She attacks everyone with all of her snakes. Emma blocks 3, and they all take the rest. Zeb and Johnny die, and Emma goes to 3 life. In her second main phase, she sacrifices 3 snakes to Goblin Bombardment, killing Emma, and Tia wins the game.